If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. What is the scariest encounter story involving Bigfoot, Skinwalkers, cryptids, or unknown creatures that personally terrifies you the most? Mothman. My mom went out on our porch one night at around 3 a.m. to smoke. It was pretty dark outside, but she could still see, and since she isn't afraid of the dark and the area we lived in at the time was pretty safe, she didn't turn on our porch light. She had the weird feeling like something was watching her, so she looked around, and she saw a huge creature the size of a very tall man with its wings wrapped around itself like it was trying to keep itself warm on our roof. She said it was way too big to be any kind of native bird in the area, and we did check to see if it was possible, but the scariest part was its eyes. They were glowing red and just locked right on her, watching to see what she would do next. My bedroom was right next to the porch, and she came and got me to try and see what it was, but by the time that I got there, no less than a minute as I was awake and couldn't sleep that night, it was already gone. My mom was freaked out for weeks and wouldn't go out on the porch alone at night for a bit afterwards. I live in northern Arizona with both the Navajo and Hopi Native American reservations in close proximity. Heard many stories about them from Native American friends in school, always had fear in their stories. Right after school I got a summer job with a herpetologist from the U of A working on his master's. The job involved trapping lizards and rattlesnakes in specific geogrids, measuring, weighing, identifying, and then releasing. The day this happened it was just before dusk, full moon coming up, right on the edge of the Navajo boundary. The roads out there tend to be really bad, so we, were in a truck and going slow. Brights were on, we saw a man standing on the side of the road, middle if nowhere, we stopped, asked if he wanted a ride, just shook his head no, so we drove on. He had a very distinctive turquoise squash blossom necklace on. A few minutes later, a huge coyote started running alongside the truck, which was strange. They don't normally do that. It kept running in front of the truck, so we stopped to let it move on, but it stopped in front of us, about 15 feet away, and just stared at us. The brights were on, and all three of us saw the necklace hanging down around its neck. After staring at us for a couple of minutes, it ran off down the road in the same direction we were going. We all said, "Did you see the necklace at the same time?" We were definitely shocked by this. About 10 minutes later we reached the paved road, and as we started to turn onto it, the headlights caught a man standing on the side of the road. It was the same man with the same necklace. There was no way a human could have traveled that distance in that amount of time. Really spooked. Now we hauled ass back into town. Mentioned it to some Navajo friends, they said never speak about it, it will come to you. When the three of us talked about it again, we had no explanation except Skinwalker, which frequently takes the shape of Coyote, the trickster. This happened in 1971. I am 71 now, and that incident is still clear as day in my memory. 25 years ago in SC, I was 10. I was riding with my friend and his dad late at night on a back road. I remember being mad because his dad ran over a possum on purpose, like it was a game. But I didn't hold that feeling long. We rounded a curve in the road, and I saw big red glaring eyes from what looked like a pale white reptilian crawler on all fours. It was really skinny, but it was fast when it turned to look at the lights and powerful when it bounded across to the ditch, and then one more up a 12-15 foot bank to disappear from sight. My friend's dad slammed on the brakes and pulled over. We all just looked at each other for confirmation that we all just saw that. The dad got out and looked around for a few minutes while I was silently thinking he was going to be attacked or something, but he just came back and we left. The Wolfman of Central Texas. Also known as the Beast of Bear Creek and the Hill Country Wolfman. I live in Central Texas, right outside of Round Rock in the Taylor area. I worked night shift armed security for a pipeline that was being installed. One night on a patrol, I got a call from one of my coworkers about seeing a massive creature, roughly 15 feet tall, being seen in the woods. It had the description of a giant wolf man but had no explicit facial features aside from the shape. Well, toward the end of November, I was out on patrol in a very dense area of the woods where we had to patrol. I had my lights off because it made it easier to see my surroundings than if I had the vehicle lights on. In front of me, about 150 to 200 yards, I see a large figure moving. Unsure of what it was, I turned on the vehicle's light bar and pod lights to light it up. Sure as shit, I see a roughly 15 to 20 foot tall beast that had the head structure of a canine with short but pointed ears, the maw of a canine that seemed a little too round to be natural, and no explicit facial features aside from eyes. The real kicker was that it stepped over a 6-foot tall cattle fence like it was a ducking baby gate. I felt a pit in my stomach, and my fight or flight had me throwing the vehicle into reverse and going back around the curve I had just come from. Needless to say, If I see it again, I'm just going to pretend it doesn't exist like the law enforcement and fire departments in the area do. Something in the woods chased me, and I don't know what it was. My family and I went on vacation to a campsite somewhere located in the woods. Everything went well, the trip to the site went smoothly, and there wasn't any trouble. We reached the site at about 9 p.m., and it took us about 2 hours to set up camp. My dad took his time. But after we set up our tents, started the campfire, made the food, and then we ate. At the site, I met a local girl, let's call her M. M told me stories that her grandfather had told her when she was younger, a legend about a creature hiding away in the woods. But I was and still am an arrogant person. Naturally, I scoffed at the statement, and I told her I was going for a walk. A few minutes went by while I was following the walking trail with my flashlight in my left hand and a knife in my right. So I was still following the path when I started hearing what sounded like a deer in the distance, but what made this weird is that it sounded like a deer but also not. I shined my flashlight left and right, trying to scare it away. And as I looked to my left, I saw it, the deer, but something was off. It didn't move like one, and it just stared at me dead in the eyes. I got creeped out, so I went on with my walk. But out of ducking nowhere, the deer stood on 2 legs. They weren't supposed to do that. The creature charged towards me at full speed. I ran away screaming for my dad. M's father came running out of his cabin with a shotgun, telling me to move out of his way. He then fired a shot, but it missed. Could someone please clarify what that was? In November of 2021, I went out hunting with my father and uncle into northeast Pennsylvania. We left around 4 to 4:30 when it was still pitch black outside. The journey and the day were relatively calm and relaxing. We traveled up some hills, saw the beautiful scenery of the Appalachian Mountains in the distance with hundreds of open acres of farmland, and walked across some paths. However, there is one strange part I still remember vividly to this day. It was encountering a bear. My uncle and I had set up a shooting range. It was for practice, in an open part of our property. I practiced with different kinds of weapons, including a rifle and sniper rifle, with my father either viewing us or setting up a target so he could shoot. Everything was going all right until my uncle randomly questioned, "Hey, is that bear over there?" He pointed into a more wooded area, and when I spotted a bear-like creature, it was smiling at us, just stalking us. The strangest thing was that it looked human-like, half human, half bear animal. I have no idea what that thing is, but it's best if we move somewhere else. We then took off towards my father's SUV when I loaded up my rifle I had on me and started to fire bullets at the area where the thing was. It disappeared. I kept firing a couple more shots just to be sure until my father said, "I think it just got scared and ran off somewhere. Simon, Marcelo, let's just put a couple more signs up, and then we'll leave." I obeyed my dad's order, and we left shortly after we were done. This probably does not sound as scary as some of the other stories on here, but this was a creepy encounter for me. I still don't know what that thing was. Does anyone know what this is? My name is Corey, and I reside in a rural community in northern Middle Tennessee. The area is primarily farmland, surrounded by thick woods and forests that stretch for miles. I'd like to share my story of a Bigfoot sighting. I've been an outdoorsman for about as long as I could hold a weapon. It was late August/early September, and we hadn't had rain for a couple weeks. My dad and I drove a truck with a trailer and 2 large 275-gallon tanks to a nearby creek and used a water pump to get water for our garden plot. We get our water, and we make our way back to my parents' house. Across the road from my parents' property was a cattle pasture with a tree line approximately 50 yards from the fence bordering the road. When we get back, we use the pump with attachments to hook it up to a sprinkler. My dad was on the trailer, with his back to the tree line and using the sprinkler to water the garden, while I would get in the truck from time to move it up when needed. When I wouldn't need to move the truck, like a typical kid, I had to move around. I couldn't sit still. I didn't have the feeling of being watched, but when I happened to look at the tree line, standing beside a large beech tree, there was a creature with light gray hair with small light brown splotches and a large head with long arms. I had been at that particular tree before, and I knew it was at least 8 feet tall. I had to double take at it because I had always believed Bigfoot existed, but I never expected to actually see one. Especially when I wasn't hunting. As soon as it noticed I was looking at it, it took 2 big steps and got behind the tree, and I never saw it again. The total time of the encounter was only about 5 to 10 seconds. The next morning, my mom, myself, and my older brother were in the garden picking corn, green beans, tomatoes, squash, okra, cucumbers, and watermelons. We entered the garden around 5:30 to combat the summer heat, as we anticipated temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit that day. At about 5:45, it was still too dark to see into the thick woods across the road. We started to hear a sound, like something was smacking a stick into the side of a tree. I was the first to notice it. When I stood up from picking green beans to see if I could see where the sound was coming from, it stopped. I said something to my mom and my older brother, and my mom made a joke, maybe it's a long-lost tribe. I hadn't told anybody about what I saw the day before. They couldn't have been as scared as I was. When I bent back down to continue picking beans, I heard the unmistakable swishing of something big moving through the air and looked back up to see a big stick tumbling end over end through the air from the tree line and hitting the trees next to our garden spot. I never saw what threw the stick, but I have a pretty good feeling I know what it was. It scared me bad enough to leave the garden and not care to get punished for it. I told my parents about it a couple years ago, but they think I made it up. Because my dad has been a hunter for over 45 years and been in the woods at all different times of day from just before daylight to all night long and has never seen anything like what I described. Doesn't matter to me. I know what I saw. Before I start typing this, I just want to note I was 11 years old at the time this incident happened. I am 14 now. To begin this story, the day it happened wasn't an unusual day. It started off like any other. I woke up, ate breakfast, and went to my friend's house. We went around the neighborhood, causing trouble, as always. Once we were done, we went to my backyard, which was around 100 feet long. We played football, soccer, baseball, all that stuff. That's when my friend noticed something out of the corner of his eye. He quickly said, "Hey, did you see that?" I, of course, didn't see anything. I asked him what he was talking about, and that was when he pointed towards the woods. The woods he was pointing at always creeped me out. Since my family moved into our house, those woods have always given me an eerie feeling when I get close to them. He then said, "You thinking what I am thinking?" I knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to explore the woods. He then told me what he thought he saw was a tall black figure peeking out from behind a tree a couple hundred feet of trees away. I was hesitant at first, but soon agreed. We walked for about an hour in the woods but found nothing. We started to head back, but as soon as we turned our backs, we heard a branch crack like someone was walking behind us. We immediately spun around but saw nothing. We were already kind of on edge about this whole situation, so we started speed walking towards my backyard. We turned our backs again, every once in a while looking behind us. We made it back to my backyard safely, but before we headed to my house, we looked behind us one last time. What I saw has scarred me to this day. Only maybe 100 feet away was an 8-foot tall creature looking at us from behind a tree. We were frozen in fear. Before we ran, it did something out of my nightmares. It didn't care if we were looking at it, so it swung its gigantic arm out from behind the tree. It pointed at us and pointed back to the woods. It then dove back behind the tree. We ran back to my house faster than we'd ever run before. I've never seen the creature again, nor have I gone back into those woods. Should I go back? My mother has told me this story various times, especially since it's one of my favorites. Not too long ago, around 2 to 3 years ago, my mother received a phone call late in the evening from a relative in Mexico. I asked her what it was about, and she told me she would tell me in the morning. The next day I asked her about it, and she replied in Spanish, "If I tell you, you better not come to me at night saying you're scared." I immediately promised that I wouldn't. But of course that was a lie, and even as a grown adult, I still seek her protection when I'm scared. She told me that her niece, who was an infant, was staying at my grandma's house for a while, and one day in the middle of the night, my grandma and my uncles and aunts awoke to the sound of small bells, laughter, and the sound of feet running around her small adobe house. In Mexico, duendes are known to make these sounds and are notorious for claiming the souls of children, especially when the child had not been properly protected while having crossed a river with their parents. Earlier they had passed by the river near my grandma's house without even bothering to protect the child from the duendes. They had forgotten the words of advice many elders had told them. Adults are usually warned not to bring children in or around rivers since shanos, duendes goblins/elves, are notorious for kidnapping kids and oftentimes infant souls. If a person were to cross the river with their child or infant without saying, "Don't stay in the river or the shanos will take you," the infant soul is usually stuck in the river, and the infant will cry throughout the night until the duendes/goblins/elves/shanos retrieve the infant from its home. In order to prevent this from happening, you must go back with the infant and speak those words at the river you crossed with the child in arms. There is also a plant called geril, which grows along the rivers and protects the child's soul from staying in the river. According to many elders, the infant/child must be wearing it for the chant/words to work. My aunts and uncles had ignored the sounds of the shanos and had fallen back asleep since they had thought nothing of it at the time. The next morning, they had found her by the door. My grandma believes the Shanos tried taking her back to the river since it was impossible for the newborn to crawl from her mother's bed to the door that was near the other side of the house. I honestly fear these creatures, and knowing I will have to visit my grandmother one day gives me chills. Especially since aliens, duendes, demons, lechuza, and pretty much anything you can think of are known inhabitants of that rural area in which they live. I was around 17 at the time. I was in the local woods with my dog one day, and everything was very peaceful. I lived in England at the time, so I heard the usual birds and bees buzzing. My dog and I make it a small clearing when we hear a huge rustle in the bushes. It sounded too big to be a rabbit or a squirrel. And it sounded too big for a human. Not thinking, I dived into a bush, holding my dog's snout, afraid he would bark. I peeked out of the hedge to see a giant black cat, like a panther, prowling around the area we were standing moments before. This creature was enormous and had yellow eyes. It looked like it was searching the area for us. I thought it would find us and attack. I felt my heart speed up. The creature growled like it was angry. It didn't find anything and began walking away from this clearing to the small trail. I slowly got up and looked to the trail, but this thing was gone. I obviously told my parents about this whole experience, and they didn't believe me. My friends didn't either and then began teasing me and tried to force me into the woods. I now live in Scotland 6 years later and still refrain from going into the woods. I am still scared I would see this creature lurking in the bushes, waiting for me to step inside. I have too. I grew up in the swamps of southeast Oklahoma, below the Kiamichi Mountains. In the same swathe of swampland that spans all the way down through Arkansas and into Louisiana, the legend of Boggy Creek took place in this swampland. We had 160 acres of cow pasture that ended where the swamp pine forests began. One day after school, me and 2 of my friends were back there playing in the creek that ran along the tree line. We looked up and saw a herd of deer coming towards us along the tree line. They saw us in the creek but kept coming. They ran past us once they got close. We gave chase. 3 young boys kept up with a herd of deer long enough for them to cross the neighbor's fence into his pasture. This was my first inkling that something weird was going on. The deer slowed down but kept going along the tree line. My 2 friends crossed the barbed wire fence and gave chase again. I was fat, so I got stuck in the fence and was left behind. Once I got loose and crossed over, I looked up to see my friends far across the field, still chasing the deer. It then occurred to me, why aren't those deer going into the forest? I hung out by the fence, and my friends eventually gave up on the deer and began heading back my way. I was just standing there, looking around at things, waiting. I looked down the tree line again to see my friends' progress and see a black shape leaning out of the trees between me and my friends. It was there for 2 seconds. And then it leaned back into the trees. My adrenaline kicked off instantly. One of my friends was over 6 feet already at that age. And he had on a black t-shirt. So for an instant, I thought I was seeing him. Then I realized both my friends were walking beside each other further down the tree line. In the next second, it occurred to me how big the black shape was. And that it had been the reason the deer would not flee into the forest. Could it have been a swamp tweaker? Sure. But whoever it was huge, bigger than the small black bears that would pass through from time to time. It has always haunted me. A year or 2 later, I was walking the trail that circled through our land. Our property had a large hill in the center, with a grove of bodark trees bunched together on top. The trail went through the grove. As I walked through the grove and came around the bend, I came upon a dead cow beside the trail, with its back to me. Not an out-of-the-ordinary thing on a cattle farm. So I went up to it to scope it out, so I could let my father know what I had found. There was blood. Blood was on the grass, and it pooled beside the cow's throat. The blood was still fresh, liquid. The cow's throat was ripped up. Like pulled apart. Again, my adrenaline kicked off immediately. I ran through all the scenarios of what could have caused this. No wildlife around that area could have done it, except maybe a cougar or a very enormous bobcat. But the cow's flesh didn't appear to have been eaten or cut by teeth and claws. It looked pulled apart. And it was fresh. Whatever had done it was still around, watching me. I could feel it watching me. I grew up fetching duck eggs out of snake ponds and camping by myself out in the woods. I don't have much fear of nature. But these 2 times tapped into a primal fear I have never felt again. That was the longest walk home of my life. Myself and about 6 other women were on a bachelorette party on a lake in North Carolina. Fire, camping for 2 nights, tequila, games, and fun. We were one of the few groups on the lake during the week. We all bed down for the night. My sister and I are on the dock, and the others are on the boat. Real casual. Sis and I spent a couple hours watching moving stars in the sky, which we were pretty convinced were aliens, and talking about existential/universe/meaning of life type stuff. We had a few discussions earlier about Sasquatch, as my sister's best friend, Kay, is an avid believer. She told us all about the knocks and calls, so we were in tune with the possibility. Anyway, we eventually fall asleep. We were awake in the morning, and I had had a very vivid dream. I started to tell the others about it, and Kay says she was having the same dream. We went over the details together, and it turns out 3 of us that night had the same experience. We were asleep but sort of conscious, like a half-sleep stage, and we saw in the water, just behind the boat, a looming figure disguised as a tree. We got a feeling of well-being, and the creature, who had to have been 15 feet tall or so to stand up out of the water like that, watched over us while we drifted back off to sleep. 3 of us dreamt the same thing, which leads me to believe it really happened. On one plane or another. Let me describe it a little better. A large, dark figure, shaggy and able to blend in with the trees. It stood not less than 15 feet tall, with lots of shaggy hair, all in silhouette. It stood a few feet behind the boat coming up out of the water. We weren't scared, really, just puzzled. We were all trying to discern exactly what it was when we all drifted back to sleep. I'm sure they exist. I think they move interdimensionally, SP, and communicate telepathically. They have a tendency to be drawn to women and feminine energy, and we were making a lot of that those nights. Bigfoot/Yetis, and rakes/crawlers. I firmly believe in both. I believe in Yetis because when I was 4, I went missing for 48 hours. I walked off the path my dad and I were on, and according to my dad, he had search and rescue looking all over the mountain we were on. 48 hours later, I was found about 75 miles from where we were at a truck stop that bordered the edge of the forest. None of that is the interesting part. The part that is interesting is that I've never changed my story since I was a child. I walked off the path, and after figuring out I had gotten myself lost, I started to cry and beg Mother Nature to help me find my dad. Mother Nature answered with this very sweet telepathic ape-like creature that, instead of fear, all I felt wash over me was a sense of safety and love. We talked for hours about my people and her people and why her people generally avoid my people. She never harmed me, and the first night she brought me back to what I can only assume was home. I got to meet other Yetis and went to sleep the next day. She, along with her partner, whooshed me on their backs and ran me faster than I could have believed possible to a place, the truck stop, where they knew my kind were. They gave me a hug and pushed me out of the forest towards the truck stop. If you thought that was the last I saw of them, you would be wrong. About a decade later, on our property that bordered the same forest, I was down in our riverbed when my brother and I heard what sounded like some people splashing and playing. We rounded the corner, and lo and behold, it was the same family of Yetis, just older, and the mother remembered me almost as quickly as I was saying to my brother, "See, I told you I wasn't lying." He tried to run, but I tackled him and told him we couldn't tell the parents this happened, otherwise, they would be in danger. To this day, my brother remembers that very clearly. I haven't seen those specific Yetis since then but have observed a few on hunting trips. I always make sure to pack a few extra oranges just in case. The rake/crawler is an easy explanation, which is I dropped one on a friend's property. It was in his abandoned barn, it jumped down from the loft/rafters, and we took off running. When I turned around, it was clear, either this thing 86's me or I 86 it. I've had my CHL since I was 21, this happened when I was 22. I let off one warning shot, thinking whatever this crackhead is on will make him stop surely, plus I was about 75 yards away from it. I'm a good shot, but I'm not John Wick. You would think it would run off the other way, but instead it seemed like that made it more angry and faster. With hollow points shot from a Glock 45 with 15 rounds, 16 if you include the one in the chamber, but that was the warning shot. It took 12 solid body shots to bring this thing down. I missed it 4 times, including the warning shot. I reloaded and shot it 5 more times in the head. I know you might think overkill, but I swear the thing kept trying to move. We phoned the sheriff, and he called a priest. They both agreed that whatever this thing is, it should be burned. I remember that day like it happened 30 seconds ago. This thing was a pinkish pale white, it ran on all 4s but could stand up on 2 legs and had a tail like a raptor. Its legs longer than its arms, the sound it made as it pursued us. It had been 8 years, and I still am sketched out by any old barn or building. When I was a child, around 10 or 11, I was laying on my bed trying to fall asleep when I began to hear this very loud scraping sound outside my house. It was a 2-story house, and my sisters and I slept on the top floor. The sound was distinctive to a metal shovel scraping against pavement or gravel. I asked my sisters, "Do you hear that?" Then they said yes. The motion light never turned on, and my parents didn't seem to notice the sound, which was unbelievable to us. It happened a few times randomly over the course of our childhood, same exact sound, close by, with no apparent explanation. Fast forward to years later, and one of my work friends comes to me and says something super creepy happened last night at her house. It's out in the country, and 4 hours away from my childhood house. She said she couldn't find her cats the evening before, so she was looking around outside, but it was getting dark. The cats usually came immediately when called for, but they were nowhere to be seen. My friend said she heard this horrible, loud sound like a shovel being dragged on pavement that came from all directions but no apparent source. She was too weirded out by it that she decided to go inside and hope the cats come back on their own. When her boyfriend got home from work, she told him she was spooked by a weird sound she heard outside that she'd never heard before. While she is telling him this, his eyes get wide, and he says, "That's the same exact sound I heard the night I saw the thing." Keep in mind her boyfriend is a very reserved and quiet kind of person. He had an experience as a child in that same house where he heard a strange sound like the dragging shovel coming from outside the house. He felt strangely compelled to investigate it alone, so he wandered outside in the dark, and as he rounded the corner of a shed, he saw the silhouette of a tall, dark being with long arms and legs standing there as the sound fell silent. He was terrified and ran back into his house and didn't tell anyone. My friend told me that he is very serious and uncomfortable about this story, and he's not one to joke or tell lies at all. After all of this, I got chills knowing that she and her boyfriend heard that exact sound my sisters and I heard, but for him it came with a creature. Makes me think there's something out there that makes this strange sound that maybe other people have experienced. By the way, her cats eventually came back home. A few days ago, my mom saw a wolf-like creature while cleaning an old cemetery that belonged to her great-grandmother's church. She described it as a tall, dog-like creature standing on its hind legs with no facial features to speak of. Upon hearing her description, I instantly recognized the creature she was referring to as the Alabama White Thing. I didn't go with her because I sprained my ankle the day before, plus I had fractured it a few months ago, and with a baseball game coming up, I decided not to go, but when she got home and told me about it, and I teased her, but her tone when she said it, I knew she wasn't lying. So I went out there today in the woods. My mom didn't want to come, so I left her in the clearing where all you can see is the main graveyard, but I noticed that there were old fallen over graves outside the fence. It didn't shock me because the land was once owned by a wealthy plantation owner with over 100 slaves until the land was purchased to build the church, but I always heard there were open graves and caskets that belonged to slaves. I went back there with some thick brush. I was fine and made it to the first fallen grave. I flipped it over, cleaned it off a bit, and set it upright where I had found it. The whole time I began to feel uneasy and looked behind me, and I caught a glimpse of it. It was a dirty white, furry dog humanoid. The creature was just standing there, not threatening or really intimidating. It looked more curious than anything, like we had intruded on each other. I quickly raised my .22 rifle, not like it would have left a dent in this creature, but I carried it more for snakes than anything else. The creature was weirdly calm and moved behind an old tree, still peeking at me. I love animals, and after seeing it go behind a tree, I lowered my gun slightly, and the creature disappeared seemingly. Though I told it like this was a rather long interaction, it only lasted a few seconds. My mind was racing and observing every detail, and even though I sound like I was rather collected, that creature could have rushed me, and I probably couldn't process it at all. After it was gone, I went back to what I was doing, telling myself that I made it up and that I was just seeing stuff. I finished a few more stones quickly and left the woods on high alert. When I got there, I said I was ready to leave ASAP and rushed into the car and said I was done, though I didn't tell my mom about what I had seen and even teased her some more. Now that I've calmed down, I know what I saw, and that thing was not my imagination. What should I do? In northern Canada, there is a small village known as Buffalo Cross. This town is completely surrounded by wilderness. The population is so declining that many of the homes sit empty and forgotten, but due to the fact that there are still some people who live there, it has been somewhat maintained. About 4 years ago, a doctor by the name of Stephen Dorian moved up there and was renting this plot of land that was just a few seconds away from the main village. The little house existed on pretty much dead land, there were no trees in this area, etc., which was odd because trees were everywhere, but he didn't think too much of it. Stephen had a dog, just a medium-sized mutt type. Every day he came home from work, and his dog was severely anxious. He would pace and whine and bark constantly towards the woods behind the house. Stephen never thought anything of it because he figured it was probably wildlife and his dog wasn't used to being around that much wildlife. However, 2 months later Stephen moved his family, his wife, and 2 kids up to Buffalo Cross, and that is when things went from strange to scary to terrifying. 2 weeks after he moved his wife and 2 kids in with him, he noticed that nightly the dog would whine to be let out, so Stephen would hook him on his chain and wait for him to do his business. This night would be different. Stephen put the dog out and needed to go to the bathroom, and he heard his dog barking and howling and growling angrily. Thinking it may have been a wolf, Stephen grabbed his gun and ran outside. Standing before him with the dog's body in his mouth was a giant wolf-like creature on 2 legs. For weeks Stephen couldn't sleep, he was always on high alert. He told his wife and son a wolf got the dog but never told anyone what he actually saw that night. 2 months after the incident, Stephen decided to look into some of the town's history, etc. What he found was shocking. Right where his home existed was a large burial plot, an Indian burial ground. He was shocked. He approached the local elder to ask for advice, and the only advice he gave was to move. But unfortunately, in this small town, houses weren't common, so Stephen had to find a way to deal with this entity or entities around him and his family. That December, right before Christmas, Stephen started hearing a sound coming from the woods. But the strangest part is that it came from not one area, but echoed from all the forested areas around him. It was a crying sound. Weeping in the woods. Stephen once again approached the elder and asked for advice because, by this point, his anxiety was high and it was starting to show with his family, and his wife was concerned, etc. It was only after his kids started seeing things and hearing things that Stephen had to turn in his notice and they had to move. To this day, Stephen refuses to discuss what the kids saw and heard. So a few years ago, me and my mom were driving home at, 3 a.m. We turned onto my street, and I was looking out the window when I saw the back of this super tall, lanky, whitish-gray hairless figure walking in between 2 houses and about to go behind them. I still remember seeing its spine because it was hunched over and so skinny. I was really freaked out, but I figured I may have been seeing things since it was so late. I stayed quiet, and my mom kept driving. A second passed, and my mom turned to me and went, "What the duck was that?" My heart instantly dropped to my stomach. She saw it too. She said that when we turned onto the block, her high beams hit it. Its eyes glared like an animal, so when the light hit it, it had big, sharp teeth and grimaced like it was angry at us, and then turned and walked away. She described the same body as me and the same manner of walking, and that it turned from us and walked back behind the houses. We were so terrified we literally didn't know what we saw. She also said that when she was driving to get me, she saw a bunch of deer on the way to the bus stop, but on her way back when we saw the thing, she saw no deer whatsoever. I live in a pretty suburban part of New Jersey, but I do have woods around. Me and my mom are still terrified by it, and I've never seen my mom scared of something like that, especially since she's seen its face. Does anyone have an idea what I saw? Why I don't camp anymore. When I was younger, I was an avid camper. I went to sleepaway camp every summer and used to go camping almost every weekend I was allowed. I was an avid rock climber and mountain biker, and I also grew up near a national park in New Jersey. The last time I went camping will forever change my life and is the reason I don't stay the night in the forest anymore. It was the weekend before I was moving away for college. I went to a pretty big college in Philadelphia, and I wanted to say goodbye to the woods one last time. My friends decided it would be fun to go up to Seneca Lake and find a clearing and camp there. After unloading the truck and taking everything to start the hike, my buddy started talking about the woods we were camping in. Now to preface this, I'm a huge skeptic. I've had weird stuff happen to me in the woods before, but I always just assumed it was other animals or even the wind. So when he was telling us about this creature with antlers that's supposed to hunt the woods, I just kind of tuned it off and focused on not falling. Once we started to get deeper into the hiking trail, I started to get this uneasy feeling, like someone was watching me from the trees on my left, since on my right was a pretty steep cliff. I couldn't shake the feeling, and now looking back, this is probably the moment where I should have turned back. I decided to just ignore the feeling and started walking slower so I could walk with the group. Once we got to the clearing, we started to set up camp. It took us longer than expected to hike the trail since my friend's girlfriend wanted to take a bunch of pictures, and it slowed us down. Anyway, we made it to the clearing right before sunset. Since we were losing daylight fast, we set up as soon as possible and started working on a fire. Even at that point, I was still feeling uneasy, but we were so busy with the tents, I couldn't really think about it. Once we were all settled and the tents were up and the fire was blazing, I realized I had to pee. It is so much easier when you're a guy, but as a girl, I had some difficulty, and with the uneasy feeling, it was so much worse. But my mama taught me not to be a coward, and if I peed my pants, I wouldn't hear the end of it from my friends, so I mustered up the courage and went into the woods a little, but stayed within eyesight of the group. As I was doing my business, I heard rustling behind me, not close enough to trigger my fight or flight, but close enough to alarm me. I didn't want to scare myself anymore, so I didn't turn around. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, probably a critter or something. I rushed to finish, then went back to the group and sat near the fire next to my best friend. While we were sitting near the fire, my friend started telling us more horror stories, and we started talking about ghosts and big feet and whatnot. Again, I tuned it out and only really joined in to make fun of our one friend who was talking about his ghost encounter. I've since then apologized. Eventually, everyone went to sleep. I was sharing a tent with my friend Allie, that's not her real name, but I needed to give her one for the sake of the story, and she woke me up at some point in the middle of the night and asked me to come with her so she can use the bathroom. We use the buddy system in case the other person gets lost. The woods are confusing enough during the daylight, at night, they're even worse. So we both get up and are making our way to the tree line. She does her business, I'm half asleep waiting for her, when all of a sudden I look over to my right and I see this buck. The animal was massive. I tried to stay calm, and I reached over and tried to get Allie's attention so she wouldn't make a noise and get the buck's attention. I alert her to the presence of the animal and count down from 5 to start running back into the clearing. She gets up, she's counting down, when all of a sudden, the buck turns his head abruptly and focuses on us. He's staring intently and starts kicking his front leg. I knew that it was going to start charging at us, so I booked it out of there. I love Allie more than anything, but at that point, it wasn't a matter of outrunning the buck, it was a matter of outrunning her. Once we got the clearing, I started shaking everyone's tent so they could come out and make noise and hopefully scare this buck away. Everyone's up and shaking their flashlights and making ourselves look big. The buck stops right at the tree line and is looking at us. All of a sudden, it turns around and goes on his hind legs and walks away. The buck walks away. I have never been terrified in my life. I hadn't and still have not ever seen a buck walk away on its hind legs. The way he walked away looked human, not like a horse doing it on their hind legs, it looked like a human walking away. I had heard many stories from elders in my community telling stories about the Sasquatch my band called them. I never believed it until I witnessed it myself. I had always dreamed of making the journey up to my original First Nations band village before the Europeans colonized, and even after it still remained isolated and hidden. I made the trip up this summer to experience the untouched landscape and beautiful wildlife. I had always heard about bears, cougars, and wolves being extremely prominent in that area. A while back, a logging company tried to move in because they spotted the extreme value of the trees, especially one tree that is sacred for its size and its characteristics and stories. The logging company landed their ships and tried to take the land, but they were surprised when all of the animals formed a line. Grizzly bears, cougars, and the rest of the creatures defended the land by attacking these loggers and not letting them get off the beach. One logger claimed that in the night on the boat, because of the weather and the water, you can only go there and can't come back until the next. A logger claimed to see a very large creature watching them from a hilltop in front of the sacred tree from my culture. My elders claimed that all of the animals were there to protect the old village with no one in it. I didn't believe any of this until I went there myself the first day we went to the sacred tree with our elders, and we were shocked to see the sheer size of this tree and what happened to it. The tree had many other trees growing out of its many limbs and was about as alive as it could ever be. As if it were undying. While we were there, many people felt a presence, including me, that we were with our ancestors. While we were there, the tree branches shook when each of us touched them and tried to grasp how spiritual this was for us. I noticed the bushes near it were crushed, and then I saw there was a hole shaped like a massive body walking through it. I didn't think about it then much. Until I heard the stories. One of my ancestors went out at night to listen to the wolves. When she came back in, she was shocked, so we all asked her what happened when she told us she knocked on a tree, and she said something big and powerful knocked back at her, in perfect sequence. She told us it was a Sasquatch. Once she said that I looked out the sliding glass door over the balcony to see a massive pair of eyes watching us, and I felt as though I was safe. I wasn't scared, I was enlightened. I'll never forget for the rest of my life watching something massive move through the bushes away from the house. I had the same experience when we reached the village the next day. I felt them watching us, and so did everyone else. Everyone knew they were there to protect us. When we reached the village, we encountered 2 fully grown grizzlies at the entrance. We were all scared until they all bowed down and moved to the side. It was as if the forest, the water, and the creatures were all waiting and ready for us. I'll never forget this trip, and I look forward to going back in the future. I'm a 20-year-old male from a little country in Europe called Croatia, so please correct me if I write something incorrect, because, as you know, English is not my mother tongue. Then, let's start with a story. I was, I think, 12 or 13 years old when this happened. I don't remember exactly. We were kids full of adventure spirit, so one day we were told by my friend's mom, I will call him Martin, that there is an abandoned church somewhere in the forest around my town and that she used to play there when she was young. So me, Martin, and another friend, I will call him Luca, accepted the challenge to find that church. So, little description of my town. My town is located in the rural part of our country, and it's surrounded on 3 sides by a forest and 1 side by the meadows. There is also one abandoned village, we call it Duretna, and that is where we 3 went. It's not completely abandoned, there are, I think, only 3 people in 3 houses, but yeah, you get the point. So Duretna is surrounded by the forest on all sides, and it's connected with the gravel roads. So we came to investigate. We came to one point where the road was too destroyed to ride bikes, so Martin and Luca went to check further on foot, and I stayed to guard the bikes. I wasn't scared because there was no legend of any scary monsters and anything around my town, and also it was maybe 1700 hours o'clock and it was summer, except that I saw a UFO 3 times in the sky before, but that is possibly for the next story. Anyway, no longer after they left, I was starting to hear loud screams that first sounded like dogs. I was starting to get nervous, so I didn't know what to do. I remember I was thinking, shit, maybe dogs attacked them, I should take this brick and go to help them. At the moment I was ready to storm, they too started to run back and yell at me to fall back. We escaped. When we thought we were safe, we started to talk about the incident. We were pretty shocked about what we experienced. Lucky for us, we recorded this with our mobile, and we can hear that sound again on the mobile phone. When we repeated the sound, I was shocked again. OMG, that doesn't sound like dogs at all. Then my friend said it sounds like someone is killing a woman. Haha. I asked Martin and Luca, did you guys see that thing? Martin answered. No, Luca added, but I think it was coming from an abandoned house in the woods. Martin said, I have a bad feeling about this. We came to investigate the abandoned church, and we discovered something sinister, like something that doesn't want us to find this. We came home, and the next day my friend Martin came to me and gave me a piece of paper from a newspaper to read. When I read the article, chills came down my spine. I read the legend about the creature they called Drekavats in English, Howler. Legend says that this is a ghost of an unborn baby that can't be destroyed or killed until he finds his own peace, and the descriptions of his howl match perfectly with the sound we heard it howl in a mix of the child crying and wolves howling. It's little to say that we never came back to that part of the abandoned village. I saw a very strange and creepy creature when I was 16. This took place in 2009 or 2010, which I don't quite remember, honestly. But leading up to this occurrence, a friend of mine and I had agreed that we would have a chill Saturday with some snacks and sodas instead of going out drinking. So snacks and sodas were bought, and I packed my laptop after having dinner with my little sister and parents, and I hopped on my scooter and rode to my friend's house. At the time, we were both really into RuneScape, so we spent hours playing and gaining XP in the game, just generally having a good time. At around 1 a.m. or so, we had been playing for quite some time, and we decided to take a break. We thought that maybe a quick walk to our old elementary school would be cool, so we grabbed our jackets and flashlight and headed out. Now, this school has since been closed down, and it was when this story took place. Now the building is being used to teach refugees and immigrants about the Danish culture and language. That's what I'm told, at least. Anyway, we get to the school in the middle of the night, and we start walking around the playground area, just having a talk about the memories of this place. We then got to an asphalted area where we used to ride moon carts and play basketball, and we reached the entrance to the soccer field. Before I reveal what we both saw on the soccer field, I want to make it clear that the fauna of Denmark is really underwhelming. Our largest wild predator is the European badger, if you don't count the wolf, of which there are about 10 in the entire country. Otherwise it's roe deer and a few elks. So the creature we saw should not be possible. So we looked out on the soccer field, and there was this creature. At first glance, you'd think it was a roe deer because of how the body looked and its posture. Also, the Lowndes Peninsula is generally a rural area, so it's not uncommon to see wildlife. Still, when we see wildlife, we stop to look and appreciate it. It's just that something was really off about this creature. Because while, yes, it had the body of a roe, its head was abnormally huge, like 3 to 4 bigger than it was supposed to be, and the shape was more that of a bear. And remember, there are absolutely no wild bears in Denmark. At one point the creature saw us about 50 to 60 meters away, and that's when we realized that its eyes were glowing red. Literally glowing. It then hissed and revealed its fangs and leapt forward a few steps. Naturally, we ran. But only for a few seconds, because as we looked back, we saw that it had stopped. It made one last hiss and sprinted to our right, towards some very thick bushes, which no one could get through without making a bunch of noise. Especially not when the wind isn't blowing, like it wasn't that night. but the creature had completely vanished, without a sound. There was no trace. My friend told his parents what we had seen the day after, and while his dad allegedly laughed and said it was just our imagination, his mom said that she had seen this thing when she was about our age at the time. She had seen it too, no more than 1 kilometer from where we saw it. Years later, my friend told me that one night, when he was getting ready for bed, he was about to lock the door when he saw it again. He saw the glowing red eyes and heard the hiss coming from behind their car. He almost fell backwards from surprise, but initially grabbed a flashlight and shined it outside. However, the creature had completely disappeared again. Now, I'm not saying that this is definitely paranormal, I'm just reporting what we saw. But to this day, I can't tell what on earth that thing could have been, only that it exists. Camping nightmare, beware of the wolf that walks. This happened to me a couple of years ago at a sleepaway camp, and it still sends shivers down my spine. I've always had a passion for the supernatural and the idea of cryptids roaming the forests, but since this encounter, I've kept my guard up. So to set the scene, 3 years ago I was on a winter camping retreat with my church called Ice Camp, and we traveled to a place called Camp Missiondo located outside of the town of Hillsdale, Michigan. The first night was pretty much uneventful, but we got to explore the campgrounds at night as well as get settled into our cabins. However, all the joy was taken out when we were told never to explore the campgrounds alone at night or the monsters will get you. For a bunch of rowdy teenage boys, we just laughed it off and went to bed. The morning was uneventful, but one detail about where my cabin was that it was across a large lake with a relatively small footbridge connecting our cabin with the main lodge and all of the other cabins. So in the main dining hall, one of the cabins mentioned how last night, none of them got to sleep because something was howling in the woods near a section called the Western Town, and my cabin didn't believe them for 1 second, and we just told them that it was coyotes, or wolves, since there have been gray wolf sightings near our camp. However, the teens were telling us this was shaken up, and they were adamant that it was something else, and we joked that it was Bigfoot. So they just told my cabin to shut the F up, and we did. Well, as the day progressed, my cabin and counselor had activities to keep us interested. However, that evening would be the worst night of our lives. It was around midnight, and we set up a bonfire to sit around and reflect upon the sermon that was given, and shortly after that we just began to talk about random stuff. When we heard a bunch of coyotes, we thought nothing of it, but then it just went dead quiet in the span of maybe a couple of minutes. Then we heard one of the most guttural howls that sound like a human being murdered mixed with a wolf howl. This made us all jump up, but we wanted answers to what we heard, so my counselor, myself, and 2 other cabin mates entered the woods with a 200 lumen flashlight, so we had good visibility, and at first, we didn't find anything. Then, way off into the distance, the furthest area the flashlight could reach, we saw 2 pairs of red glowing eyes looking at us, and as it got closer, we thought we saw wolves, but the movements were unnatural. It was more like a person down on all fours. My counselor told us to move away slowly, but the creature kept approaching, and before I can remember, the second one stood up and began to charge us, and we ran as fast as we could. We yelled to our cabin mates to get their butts to the cabin, and of course, they were confused as to why we were running until they heard the same howl as earlier, and we hauled ass from the bonfire across the footbridge, but we stopped halfway because we thought it wouldn't go any closer. Until we heard the wood creaking rapidly, and my entire cabin booked it once again, this time up to my cabin, and we bolted the door shut. Whatever had followed us was now circling the cabin. All of us were freaking out, but then the thing looked into the window, and I got a good look at what it was. It had a humanoid built body, muscular yet lanky at the same time, and the head wasn't like that of a Sasquatch, it was like that of a wolf. All night we heard scaping and heavy footsteps. Until early morning, the creature lost interest and departed. I went to get some breakfast early that morning, and to my horror, I found a large set of claw marks in the wood and a large set of footprints leading towards the woods. So after that harrowing encounter, I found out that the thing we saw was not Bigfoot, but rather an older cryptid from Michigan folklore called the Michigan Dog Man. Ever since then, I refuse to go to a sleepaway camp because whatever I see, I know it will still be roaming the campgrounds. I grew up in West Jefferson, Ohio, which is a rural village just outside of Columbus to the west. In the summer of 2009, I was about to start my freshman year of high school. I used to play in the woods towards the edge of the village by the old, New Hampton Cemetery. My friends and I would hop the gates and crawl under the barbed wire fence where it was cut, giving us enough room to low crawl under it. Beyond this, there were acres of woods and a water treatment plant, as well as a creek that ran through. One day when I was out enjoying nature in those woods, suddenly I got a deep sense of dread. I didn't see anything suspicious, but something in my gut was telling me to get the hell out of the woods. I noticed around this time that it was completely silent, and I could no longer hear the birds. I sprinted out of the woods as fast as I could, crawled back to the other side of the fence, and entered the cemetery where my friend and I had left our bikes. He had been with me and ran with me out. When we got to our bikes, we noticed two ominously glowing yellow orbs that looked like eyes in the tree line we had just exited. We rode our bikes home and never spoke about it again. Can anybody help me identify what they think this could have been? For reference, we don't really have any predators in central Ohio. It could not have been a bear, and we don't really have wolves. The yellow orbs were eye level. So with how high up off the ground they are, they could not have been a coyote. Also, I know running like that was the stupidest thing I could have done, I know that, but back then I didn't know cryptids were a thing. Years ago, when I was younger, probably 10 years old, I was staying at my grandparents' house while my parents were at work. My grandfather always owned livestock, mainly cows, and I loved going with him during the evening to feed them. This particular afternoon, for some reason, I didn't go with him to feed the cattle, mainly because I was ready to go home and it was getting close to dark. To get to the barn where the cows were fed, you had to walk across the pasture and cross a creek to get to the other field where it was located. As my grandfather set out through the pasture, we watched him from the back sliding glass doors, and he soon went out of sight through the woods across the creek. As always, my grandmother got up and locked the doors as a precautionary measure. As we watched the television waiting for him, my grandfather, to get back, we were soon shocked when we saw him sprinting through the field, jumping the fence, and almost knocking down the door before we could open it for him. Out of breath, pale as a ghost, and shaking, we had to calm him down before he could talk. He exclaimed that one of the heirs has calved, or given birth, and that something had dismantled the calf's body and only eaten its stomach out. He told us it was a fresh kill because the blood was still warm, and the cow was pacing about 20 yards from her dead calf. As he looked for the baby's killer, he soon saw something he'd never forget. Standing upon the hill was a bloody half man, half kangaroo. The top half was man, and the bottom half was kangaroo. Even though we saw his distress, we laughed in his face. He then drove us through the field with a loaded shotgun and showed us the half-eaten calves. We then knew he wasn't joking. A few months passed by and the commotion had died down about the kangaroo man until it came across Channel 4 news that a neighborhood woman's dog had been eaten alive. The woman being interviewed cried at the fact her dog was dead and that what had killed it was a monster. She said it was half man, half kangaroo. Since then, my grandfather has passed, and the legend of Kangaroo Man lives on. We built a house on the land, and to this day, I believe the Kangaroo Man haunts our woods. The most recent experience with the Kangaroo Man was about a year ago. A few friends and I were about 70 yards away from my house. It was about 11:30 p.m., and as we headed towards the house in the tall grass in the field, we heard something strange. We paused for a second and glanced around, not really seeing anything. We then heard a loud, insidious noise coming from the tall grass about 20 feet away from us. My two friends looked at me for guidance, and all I could do was shout run. I knew exactly what it was. We hightailed it out of the pasture to my house and swear we heard it chasing us. We quickly locked the doors and stayed in my room for the rest of the night. Not waking my parents in fear they wouldn't believe us and that we were playing a joke. I no longer go outside after dark, or alone for that matter. I'm patiently waiting for the day I come upon Kangaroo Man myself. In 1991, my now wife and I were out on a driving date, and I was trying to take her to a place where I could possibly get some snuggles by scaring her. It was a clear late fall, early winter evening, no leaves on the trees, cold, but not snowing yet. There is a place in Wadsworth, Illinois, just north of Waukegan, a suburb of Chicago, called St. Patrick's Cemetery. This is an old wrought iron graveyard, way out on an old dirt road in the middle of nowhere, away from most civilization. This graveyard has a long history of unofficial satanic activity and also has a legend about a ghost car being driven by someone you can't see and an old pale-skinned lady in the backseat. This place is a very popular location for kids trying to be brave, prove themselves, and show how tough they are. I was once there with a group of friends at about 11 p.m. We entered the gate and walked into the shadows. We heard something growl, but not like anything we heard before. We then heard twigs breaking behind us, and we all hauled butt to the gate. But one friend went to jump the 7-foot wrought iron fence. He threw the baseball bat he was carrying over the fence and beat it to the ground on the other side. Anyway, my now wife and I were driving to the location from the backside, where she didn't recognize where we were, as she was terrified of this place. I began to slow my 1990 Beretta GTZ down, and she was sitting sideways facing me, with the graveyard to her back. She suddenly realized where we were and began begging me to go and get out of there, but me, being the scheming teenager I was, started to pretend the car was having issues. She was almost scared to tears, so I decided this was a terrible idea and slowly started to pull away. She looked out my driver's door window, turned white, and started screaming. I was kind of chuckling at her, until I turned to look and saw something. This thing was easily as large as a bear height-wise, there are no bears for hundreds of miles of that location, was jet black, had the face and snout of a dog almost, but with the biggest teeth I have ever seen. Its eyes were yellow, and it was actually drooling on the window. I of course screamed like a teenage girl, and when I did, this thing let out a roar, unlike anything I have ever heard. It was 100% not a dog, not a bear, or anything I have ever seen before. I slammed my car down to second gear and punched it, and this thing ran right next to my window slobbering and screaming and gave up and trotted away when I hit about 60 miles per hour. We were both scared beyond words, and naturally, our date was over at that point. We went back the next day, during daylight, to see if we could see anything, tracks, or any kind of evidence to explain exactly what this thing was. There were some scratch marks next to my tire tracks in the gravel, but nothing to suggest exactly what this thing was. As we approached the graveyard, there was this overpowering smell. It was so strong you could taste it, and the closer we got, the worse it got. We looked into the graveyard, and there was a grave dug up, a coffin on the ground, open. I have only told one other person this story, a good friend of mine who has done a ton of research on Resurrection Mary, an almost world-famous ghost story in Chicago. He told me it sounded like a creature called a hellhound. He spoke to a friend of his from England named Mike Hallowell, a prominent ghost hunter and researcher, who used this story in his paranormal newspaper he publishes in England. He also agreed it sounded like a hellhound and that we should never go back there again. We have since moved away, but go back to visit family and friends, and maybe, being a little older, we might go back there on a return trip back home and just see what happens. Mothman sighting in 2020. The O'Hare area has been getting a lot of reports of these sightings. Manuel Navarrete of UFO Clearinghouse received a report recently from a woman who said that she and her mother witnessed a demon with red eyes and enormous wings at around 9 p.m. on October 26 in Schiller Park, Illinois, a village on the outskirts of Chicago's metropolitan area. According to the initial report received by Navarrete, I had gone to the kitchen to make myself a cup of tea, and as I was filling the kettle with water, I heard my mom scream and then call out to me. I dropped what I was doing and ran to her and found her in her room with the lights off. She told me to keep the lights off and to come to the window and look out into the backyard. I looked and saw a large creature with red eyes and enormous wings perched on the back fence. My mother was whispering "Es un demonio" and started praying as we watched this thing. It was perched on the fence, and it was looking side to side and kept slowly moving its wings. We looked at it for about a minute before it flapped its wings and flew off. It's a demon. The initial report came from a 32-year-old Hispanic woman who witnessed the creature alongside her 67-year-old mother. Navarrete said that he was able to speak with both witnesses on Wednesday following their sighting. He confirmed the approximate time of their sighting, along with the details originally submitted in the report. The woman had been in the kitchen making herself tea when she heard her mother scream, prompting her to drop what she was doing and run toward her mother's bedroom. The witness indicated that her mother has fallen before and injured herself, and that is what she thought had just occurred, said Navarrete. Upon entering her mother's room, she found the lights off and her mother standing by the window, he continued. The mother told her to keep the lights off and to come to the window and look out into the backyard. The witness did as she asked and, upon reaching the window, saw what she described as a large humanoid creature perched upon the back fence. She described the creature as black with large, jet black wings and human-like features. When I asked her to go into detail, she said that the creature looked like what she could only describe as a demon. The creature had human-like arms and legs, and its head looked almost human with bright red eyes. When I pressed for more detail, she advised that it was dark and she was about 25 feet away from where it was perched. She described the creature as looking around and slowly moving its outstretched wings back and forth. Navarrete added that the witness told him she had observed the entity for about a minute before it flapped its wings and flew up and out of sight, and that when asked if she had grabbed her phone to take a picture, she said her phone was in her room and she did not think of going and grabbing it, and she was not going to leave her mother alone. The woman's mother was at first hesitant to speak with him, but Navarrete said she agreed after receiving assurances that I would not publish her name or address. The older woman spoke only in Spanish, said Navarrete, and told him that she was getting ready for bed when she looked out the window and saw the creature perched on the back fence. She said she was scared and called out to her daughter to come and then started to pray, he explained. The witness was convinced that she was seeing a demon that had come to her house and prayed for protection. She described the creature's shape and posture as similar to the depiction of a demon being struck down by Saint Michael, except this one was solid black and with red eyes. Navarrete said the woman went on to say that she was very uncomfortable with speaking about it for fear of the entity returning and that she felt that this creature was on a mission, one that was evil in nature, but she would not expound any further. She did mention that there were people in the neighborhood that she knew practiced brujeria and that this thing might have something to do with it, he added. Schiller Park borders O'Hare International Airport to the southeast, an area that has been the epicenter of recent winged humanoid sightings in the Lake Michigan Mothman investigation, with at least 10 sightings coming from the airport itself since August of 2019, and many more reported in the surrounding communities. Other witnesses in and around the same area have similarly reported feeling a sense of evil during their sightings, including a trucker who said he was standing outside of a cargo dock at O'Hare when he spotted a 7-foot-tall person with wings just outside of a fence by the parking lot on November 26, 2019, a cargo company employee who said that he'd seen a red-eyed, winged humanoid while driving near O'Hare on the night of December 6, 2019, and 2 women who said they encountered a huge owl with glowing red eyes that looked like they belonged to the devil himself near a parking lot at O'Hare on June 30, 2020. This is a story told to me by my mother. She was around 15 years old at the time. Growing up in a small rural Connecticut town in the early 70s, there were a lot of woods and not a lot of things to do, so sleepovers were all the rage for teenage girls. This particular night, my mom was dropped off at her friend's house. Her friend, we will call her Jan, lived in a small farmhouse tucked back into the woods, away from the main road and far from the neighbors. The house was white and had a porch that, instead of being in the front, was attached to the back of the house, facing the backyard and the woods. The last bit of information I'll give before starting the story is the door. Being a farmhouse, the door that led into the side of the house had a gap under it about 9 inches. In the winter, a block would be placed under it to keep the cold out. This encounter happened in the spring, so the block had been removed. Now on to the story. It was a Saturday night and my mom had been dropped off at Jan's house. Jan's parents had gone out for the evening, leaving the girls alone. For the first part of the night, my mom and Jan did the normal sleepover things like gossip and do each other's hair. Around 9:30, they decided to watch a little TV in the living room. Suddenly, they heard the porch creak as something heavy climbed onto it. Both girls stared at each other and listened as whatever it was started walking around the porch very slowly. "Maybe it's Tom?" Jan asked. Tom was her older brother who was supposed to be out with his friends, and he wasn't above playing practical jokes on his younger sibling. My mom rolled her eyes, stood up, and walked over to the back door. She flipped the light on and went to pull the curtain back to peer outside when they both heard whatever it was jumping off the porch. My mom peered into the darkness past where the light reached and saw a figure dart into the woods. She replaced the curtain, left the light on, and went back to January. Whoever it was is gone now. It was probably Tom. Jan nodded, and they went back to watching TV, still a little unnerved. They had just started to relax when a shadow passed by the back door and the porch creaked again. It was back. They listened as whatever it was walked slowly across the porch, heading towards the side of the house. They also heard what sounded like nails being dragged against the side of the house. Both girls were terrified. Whatever it was made it to the end of the porch and was now heading to the side door. For a few minutes, there was silence. My mom and Jan looked towards the side door. Maybe it was Tom. Suddenly a hand was thrust under the gap in the door. It was covered in a reddish-brown fur, the fingers longer than any human fingers should have been, and had jagged black claws. It used its claws to scratch at the bottom of the door. Both girls screamed loudly. There was a strange grunt from outside the door, the hand was pulled back, and they could once again hear the creature run away. Still screaming, Jan grabbed the door block and shoved it under the door. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen, and both girls sat huddled behind the couch until Jan's parents came home. They were greeted by 2 terrified teenagers. My mom begged to be taken home. Of course no one believed them. Tom was blamed and yelled at when he arrived home the next day. But my mom maintains to this day that she knows what she saw and heard. I am a 14-year-old male from Victoria, Australia. I live about half an hour from Geelong, which is around 1 hour from Melbourne. My area is what is considered the country. I also have a large reserve, which is only about a block from my house. This story takes place around 2 weeks ago. I was home alone on a Saturday night. My mother was with my father in Melbourne for a business meeting, while my sister was with her boyfriend and would be home later. I was in the lounge room watching TV when I heard a thunk on the front porch. It was too early for my sister to be home, so I thought it was the neighbor's dog. He can sometimes jump the fence and come looking for food or something to play with. I went to the front door and looked through the window to the side. It was not the dog. There was a tall figure, maybe 210 centimeters tall, which is about 7 feet for Americans. It had goat's legs covered in gray fur with black hooves and bright yellow eyes, which looked right back at me. I ran back to the living room in blind panic. What the duck was that? I thought. In a random idea, I grabbed my phone and started playing the loudest song I could find, which happened to be Hero by Jonathan Young. This was an attempt to either scare or lure the beast away. Then I heard a window smash behind me. I ran to the kitchen to grab something to protect myself. Which ended up being a cleaver. This thing started thudding down the hall towards the room I was in. It was probably 30 seconds, but it felt like hours, waiting for that thing to appear. Finally, I spotted its glowing eyes in the darkness and ran at it swinging. I felt my knife stab into something, and I pushed it deeper while twisting. The creature screamed in pain and pulled back, running away and jumping back out the window. I spent the next 3 hours locked in my room with 2 knives and a torch next to me. When my sister came home, she asked what was wrong, but I just stuttered. Window go goat stab. Over and over. My sister came out with me to look around, and we found large hoof prints in the hall and in the yard. We stayed together the entire night. I still heard the clapping of its feet every night just outside my window. Probably looking for what hurt it or a new way in. It hasn't come back for a few days, and I'm hoping I don't see it again. Thank you for listening. I will be sharing a story about my interaction with the Palmyra wolves, among many others. This story takes place in 2018. My friends G, Brian, Sarah, and I love exploring forests and abandoned buildings. Occasionally we work up the courage to go to alleged haunted buildings. G found a cool little area in the woods in Palmyra that was perfect for camping. He called and informed us, and we all started getting ready to go camping for the weekend. I was in charge of bringing food and some sort of protection, so I grabbed my father's machete. A few hours later, he picks Brian, Sarah, and I up at my house. Halfway there, we went to the store for tents and extra batteries. When we leave the store, Brian and I get a weird feeling. But it was a new area for me, so I brushed it off. Later, we finally got to the campsite, and we set up the tents. G and Brian start a fire. Sarah and I unpack the food and put fresh batteries in the flashlights. We eat dinner and go to bed. Around 2:30 a.m. Sarah wakes me up crying, saying she saw something in the woods. This was unusual. Sarah never cried in front of anyone, but she was terrified, so I grabbed a flashlight, and we walked out and looked around. We see and hear nothing, so I say, "Your eyes are just messing with you, it's fine." She nods and goes back to her tent, and I go back into mine. 10 minutes later we hear the most bone-chilling scream ever, and everyone jumps out. I grab the machete, and we all stand back to back with flashlights pointed out in the forest. We all look, and Brian says, "Guys, I see 4 pairs of eyes." We look, and about 50 feet away we see the eyes. One of them walks out, and it was 7 to 9 feet tall, and we back up slowly so we don't piss it off more. It makes the most monstrous growl ever. We turn around and run to the truck. We get in and decide to drive to a hotel and come back in the morning when the sun was out. We get there and rent out a room and stay there. We wake up around 10:30 and go back to get our stuff, and all the tents were ripped to shreds and our backpacks were spread across the campsite. We grab all our stuff and promise to never come back. I always believed in the possibility of Bigfoot. I even wished to have an experience. I got my wish. In the late summer of 2002, me, my husband, our 5-year-old son, our 3-year-old son, and my mom, lived in the rural county of Buckingham, right in the middle of Virginia, US. We lived a mile up a little dirt road, right off what was just barely a main road into the closest town. To the north of us, along the dirt road, was a large dairy farm and the farmer's home. The farmer had 100 acres of pasture and several hundred forested acres. That property was bordered to the north by the James River. Across the little dirt road from us, about 3 winding miles to the east, was a hunt club that sat on 1,500 acres. I think we saw maybe 4 trucks turned down that way in the 5 years we lived there. In the few thousand acres surrounding us, there were only 3 homes, including ours. We were in the middle of nowhere. I stayed home with the boys, the very active boys. We were always outdoors, lots of walks, playing in the pool, being loud. Just a few days before the incident, I began feeling watched outside and inside. Our home had several large picture windows, including my bedroom. Because of our location, we never kept the curtains closed. One night, in my bedroom with the lights on, all the hair on my body stood up. I could feel eyes on me from out of the pitch black and across the road. All the curtains were quickly closed. During those days, there were several odd occurrences. Before I go on, I need to describe a few more things. Directly in front of the house, across the road, were endless woods. On one side of our home, about 200 feet away, was a huge vegetable garden. Just past the garden, the cow pastures began, and the cows in pasture could be seen for about 1/3 mile. 50 feet on the opposite side of the home began more endless woods. There was an in-ground pool surrounded by a 4-foot chain fence about 15 feet from the back sliding glass doors. From the back left corner of the pool fence, the land sloped down slightly. A couple hundred feet behind the home were 2 steel outbuildings. 100 feet behind those were more woods. Almost exactly 3/4 mile from the back door is a creek. Animals. Lots of animals. Deer, fox, a few bears, and the rarely seen coy wolf. Because we were outside so much, at all hours, we all knew the normal sounds and smells. Other than feeling watched, the first thing I noticed were the cows. They were mooing in a different way. Just different. Then they started huddling together on the side of the pasture farthest from the woods. Every once in a while a horrid smell would intrude. With all the animals around, we were used to occasional bad smells. This one was noticeably different. Dead skunk, rotten eggs, and a touch of vomit. Me and the boys heard what sounded like pebbles hitting the roofs of the steel buildings. The only pebbles were at the creek. Usually if anything is going to hit those buildings, it's the odd pine cone taken by a strong wind. I looked but didn't find anything in the overgrown grass back there. When my mom and husband came home one evening, he noticed something strange in the garden. There were clearly areas where plants were smushed down and some tops were torn off and gone. Now the cows could have smushed but torn and taken? Maggie, our normally super chill-year-old mutt, had started growling, seemingly at nothing. These types of things carried on for 3 days. On a Sunday evening, after making the hour-long drive home from getting groceries, we were all in the van on our dirt road. It was dusk but already pretty dark under all the trees. For the first and only time, a bobcat darted across the road. Pulling into the driveway, I noticed that cows were huddled right up against our property. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was off. I asked my mom to get the boys in and keep them in. My husband got the same vague, something's wrong feeling. We hurriedly got the groceries in. All the while Maggie's growling into the darkness. Around 9 p.m., the cows started making a ton of noise, and almost immediately, Maggie started barking. Stepping out back, we saw the cows had jumped their fence, were on our property, and our little dog was herding them back onto their side. Just before we walked back in, that smell came wafting by. Around 11 p.m., with the kids asleep and the grown-ups getting ready for bed, Maggie goes crazy. She's on the back porch, running back and forth between the pool fence and the back sliding glass doors, doing a frantic bark/growl noise. She woke the boys up. All of us are pressed up against the back doors, but we can't see anything past the 15 feet of the porch light illumination. My husband goes to get the flashlight, and I step out onto the back stoop. Maggie runs inside, but when I take a couple more steps, she runs back out in front of me and starts growling again. I picked her up to try to calm her, and it works momentarily. Her little heart is racing so fast I'm more concerned for her for a second. With her silence, I take note of the eerie scene. The air is thick and heavy. There are no cows in sight. There are never no cows in sight. Silence. Nothing. None of the usual night noises. I'm in a vacuum. Everything is in slow motion. It feels like forever, but it was just seconds. My husband came up behind me with the flashlight already on and snapped me out of it. Maggie jumped out of my arms and started growling, trying to protect us. Shining the light where Maggie is telling him to, he remarks that the smell just hit him. I smell it too. Scanning the area behind the far corner of the fence, where the land slightly slopes, we see it. In our line of sight, right where the bottom of the fence meets the grass, next to a big pine tree, there is a set of eyes looking straight at us. They are amber, about 3 inches apart, very round, and shining. My husband grabs my shoulder and pulls me back. Neither of us takes our eyes off of it, and it doesn't take its eyes off of us. After a moment, the eyes rose in an incredibly fluid motion, at least 4 feet. There's the faintest outline of half of what appears to be a huge man. My husband yelled, "Get out of here." Within a second, the eyes closed, and we couldn't see anything. There was no noise of something moving away. Not knowing where it was almost as scary as seeing the eyes. We grabbed Maggie, rushed inside, walked backwards, and locked the door. My mom had put the boys in a closet and made sure everything was closed and locked. We turned off the lights so we could see through the darkness. After we calmed the boys down and got them back to sleep, we questioned, reasoned, and analyzed what we experienced until dawn. It was a bear. No. We've had bear. The dog doesn't act like that. The bears take off when the barking starts. Bears make noise. What other animals are around that could be a candidate? None. What has that shape? Nothing. None of us have ever felt that uncomfortable when there's an unwelcome creature close by. Thinking about all those odd things that led up to this, we truly believe it was a Bigfoot. Our setup was perfect for one. Lots of animals, a garden, a creek, and forest as far as you can see. The next morning we went to where we saw it, but the ground was really hard rock and clay covered in pine needles, so no prints. We got pretty accurate measurements. The eyes started right around 4 feet off the ground and then went up to 8 feet. Things were still a bit off that day, but the next day everything seemed back to normal. It took me a couple weeks to go back into the woods. We all can still vividly remember it. What if Maggie had cowered and hid? This happened a few months ago, while I, my boyfriend at the time, and a friend of ours were walking around near the river in our town. We live in a small town in Florida right on the St. Johns River, so unless you're into fishing, there's not much to do. It was getting late, around 10 p.m., when we decided to go check out this abandoned furniture factory a few streets over. When we got there, we checked the doors in the front to see if they were unlocked by any chance. They were locked, of course. We walked to the side of it where it had been partially demolished a few years ago. The lower part of the walls that had been there was still standing, making a fence-like barrier we'd have to climb over. I leaned over the wall to see if we'd be able to walk through there, but there was too much rubble and weeds in the way. We decided to leave and head back to our cars. I was halfway to the sidewalk when, from the weed-filled area, came a deep, growly hey. I stopped and looked behind me as the color drained from my face. As I watched, I saw some of the weeds move. That's when I ran, leaving behind my boyfriend and friend. We ran almost 2 blocks before we stopped and started walking through the neighborhoods back to the cars. The entire way back, we heard something climbing across roofs, had rocks flung at us from tops of trees, and a pale figure run quickly past us. The entire time this was happening, I had a strong feeling of dread. We got back to our cars safely but stood there for a few minutes trying to calm down some before we drove. It was all calm for a minute before we heard the creature climb up to the roof of a converted bank. It paced back and forth just out of the reach of the light, throwing things at us and into a tree a few times. It was so scary being followed like that through an area I used to feel so safe in. I did some research when I got home, and the growl, the paleness, and the speed at which it ran matched the description I found in rake encounters. I think it only followed us and threw things because there were 3 of us there staying close together. Hopefully I won't encounter it again, at least not alone. I am a Native American, and, in my culture, we have many myths, legends, and folklore. One example of folklore in my culture is the Skinwalker. For those that do not know, a Skinwalker can take the form of various creatures. However, they will always be slightly different, like a cat with dog fur or a dog with cat's ears and human eyes. I have been told stories passed down for generations. As I began telling my story, this is on a first-hand account, and everything that is being said is true. Now, with that being said, let's get started. When I was younger, my little brother and I noticed an owl was following us around. We had noticed that this owl was not a regular-sized owl. This owl was roughly around 5 feet tall. We had also noticed that it would linger around us and watch us. We had considered this to be normal. We never showed any form of fear or anything to that extent. My brother and I began to develop the belief that this owl was a form of protector. Our mom had mentioned that the owl had arrived around the time we were born and began to follow us everywhere we went. When we were younger, we lived on a farm. Any time we would throughout the land, the owl would be around us. Our mom had also told us about how the same owl would sit on the stop sign at the end of the road if we had gone somewhere. When we got closer to our house, the owl would follow the car back to our property. When we turned 13 years old, I noticed that the owl had stopped coming around the house or following us. When I was 16, I ended up getting into a huge argument with my dad, and I ended up staying at my mom's house for a good while. One night I had returned to my dad's house. It was my first time being at their house in months. As nighttime began to rise, I noticed the same owl was at the house. Around 3 a.m., I heard the owl outside. I went to check and saw the owl. I waved to the owl and began walking to my grandpa's house. During this time, the bathroom in my parents' house was being worked on, so we had to go to my grandpa's house to use the restroom. As I started walking towards my grandpa's house, the owl began to follow me towards his house. In between the houses, there is a good amount of land, roughly about the length of a football field. As I continued walking to my grandpa's house with my dog, I noticed that the owl was alarmed and began hooting frantically. I looked up at the owl to see where it was, and then I looked down to see if there was anything around the area. As I was doing so, I heard movement in a brush in another field, the same field where the cows were located. I soon began to see a big black mass, This mass is roughly about 2 feet bigger than a Shetland pony. My dog had noticed it and began to growl and run. As I was walking towards the gate, I saw a normal-sized black dog that was not supposed to be there. The dog then began to run towards the stables, where my dog ran. After the dog ran away, I continued to walk towards my grandpa's house to use the bathroom. When I was finished, I had gone back outside and noticed my dog was standing on my grandpa's porch, visibly scared and shaking. I patted her to make sure she was okay and calmed her down. When she was calm enough, we began walking back to my parents' house. As we were doing so, I heard a noise behind my grandpa's truck, which was roughly 20 feet away from the porch. I had pulled out my knife that I would use as a form of self-defense if I ever got attacked by an animal. I walked off the porch and approached the truck. As I approached the truck, I noticed a creature standing about 5 feet away from me. This creature looked somewhat like a dog, but it was not a dog. I then remembered that it was the same figure that I saw in the field earlier. After coming out of the stage of shock, I realized that I am standing 5 feet away from a medium-sized creature holding a knife while it's staring me down and growling. One of the first things I noticed was its front paws, but they did not look like normal paws. They were elongated and had similarly looked like fingers, and they were more spread out than a dog's paw. I had then noticed that its head slowly began to come out of the darkness. I had noticed its eyes, some brown but also whiter around the eye. It then begins to move closer to me. The legs were shaped similarly to a dog's legs, however, the creature's legs were more muscular like a human. I immediately reacted by throwing the knife at its paw. The creature had barely moved its paw fast enough to not get hit. I then hear the owl screech loudly, and the dog looks at me. I'm closing the distance between me and the creature. It then looks up as the owl begins to fly above me and my dog. I had noticed that the creature was distracted by the owl. I had taken this opportunity to grab the knife, and I made an attempt to stab the creature. The creature jumps back to avoid the knife, turns, and runs back towards the field. I can hear the owl flying back towards the field where the creature had run. I slowly and cautiously make my way back towards my parents' house. As I approach the gate from the field and enter the yard, I hear a yelp and a loud thud, followed by a screech. I looked up and saw the owl fly from the cow field towards a tree sitting in the yard of my dad's house. When the owl had landed, I looked at the owl, and it had looked at me and began to hoot. As the owl did so, I ended up getting a feeling that the owl was telling me to go inside and that everything was going to be okay. The next morning, I woke up and went out to the field where the creature came from. I found a large patch of the brush that was flattened, but there was no blood or carcass from the creature that had tried to attack me. I had also noticed that the owl was not around the property. I am now 22 years old and have not seen the owl or the creature since that night. My dad is still located on the same property that I grew up on, and I do visit the property frequently. After that night, I do not know what happened to the owl or the creature. But one thing that I do know is that this event did occur. I fully believe that I encountered a skinwalker. I also believe that the owl was there to protect me one last time. I don't know what to think about this story, and I have never shared it because I never thought anyone would actually listen to or believe me, so what better place to tell it than here? So I live in Ontario, Canada. One time I was up visiting my aunt. She lives on 2 acres of land, and there's dense forest area and there's tall grass that surrounds the back of the yard. If you're standing on the porch, you'd be able to see hundreds of trees. It's so dense you can get stuck if you don't walk between them properly. I used to stay there on the summer break when I was young. I was about 13 years old at the time. And just to get the description of the house, it's a 1-story home. It has one big porch in the front, and beside that big porch there's another door leading into the mudroom, and that door has its own little porch, and beside the mudroom there's a 1-story home. It has one big porch in the front, and beside that big porch there's another door leading into the mudroom, and that door has its own little porch, and beside the mudroom there is the master bedroom, which has a sliding glass door leading to the outside. And that's all on one side of the building that's facing the forest. And one night I was staying over in the summer. I was just hanging out with my aunt watching a movie in her room, the master bedroom, and I noticed something in my peripheral vision, and the creature or entity whatever it was. It looks like it would have been a dog or a wolf, but it was really skinny, like it was malnourished, and it was really big. If it wasn't for the moon lighting up the yard just enough, I would have thought it was a bear. It looks like you would have taken a wolf or a dog and scaled it up to the size of a bear. And I wanted to take a better look, so I got off the bed and I was looking out the window of the sliding glass door, because it's a weird sliding glass door because one side the door moves because the sliding glass door, and then the other side has a little window, so I opened it and I was looking out of it. Behind that door is a screen, so I was looking out the window at this thing. I was like, what is this that can't be a dog and it can't be a wolf because it's too big and it's malnourished? It just doesn't make any sense. I was looking at it for a few minutes wondering what it could be, and then it was starting to make a screeching noise like it wasn't like a whine. It was like a high-pitched screech, and it seemed to be eating something that was in our yard, and my uncle wasn't there at the time, so we had no protection because you could have pulled out one of his guns to protect us, but my aunt was asleep. She fell asleep watching the movie, so I built up enough courage to open the main door at the front with the big porch, and I was going to the garage that sits next to the house, like right next to it. So I open the sliding glass door and I go take a step onto the porch, and it is a pretty old porch, so it has creaks and crackly noises, so I went to take a step by step down, and it made a big creaking noise and the thing turned and looked at me. He didn't move, just stared at me, and it started screeching a little bit, so I ran to the garage, not thinking to tell my aunt or anything. I ran as fast as I could to the garage, slammed the door, locked it behind me, and the dog was in the garage because the dog really likes to be in the garage because it's cool at night. So I go into the garage and lock the doors behind me. I try to look out the windows in the garage to see where it is and see if I can get a better look at it because the garage is a little longer than the house, so I could see a little bit farther back into the yard, and I noticed that the dog is a little bit cowering in the corner of the garage where it's bad. And where the garage is and the way it's built, it's kind of slanted, but it has a flat roof, and there's gazebos slanted, but it has a flat roof, and there's gazebos on a side of the garage to keep the cars in for the winter, and I notice this thing is not in front of the garage where I can see, and I hear it screeching on the side of the garage that I can't see, and I hear something on the roof. It jumps onto one of the gazebos and jumps up onto the roof, and the roof is really thin, it's made of tin, and there's a thin layer of particle board. And it runs around the roof and it stops, and so I can hear it scratching and sniffing around trying to find his way in, and then it jumps off behind the back of the garages facing the forest. There's 2 doors, which is where I saw it jump down, so I turn off all the lights and I hide in the corner on the right side where the dog is. I hear it sniffing and scratching at those 2 doors trying to get in, and those 2 doors are really flimsy, so every push and shove it made the door move in and out in, and the back of the yard is a trail at the back where the yard ends, and there was a 4-wheeler, and I see it's one of the neighbors, and the sound of the 4-wheeler scares it away, and I hear it runs into the forest. I stay in the garage for the rest of the night, and once the sun came up, I ran inside and told my aunt. This happened when I was about 12 or 13 years old. I live in southern Michigan, and a lot of strange things happen in these woods. So a little backstory here, my dad and I volunteered for a bird banding station. Bird banding is where a researcher catches a bird and puts a tiny numbered band on its leg to study its migration patterns. We are careful not to hurt the birds, so we set up mist nets to catch them rather than the traditional trap. They were always released in the end. The land we banded on was owned by the head researcher, let's call him R. R's property was massive, with forests, marshlands, countryside, you name it. I loved to explore it while the banders were tagging birds. However, something happened that made me be more cautious when out in the woods alone. It was a slow summer morning, and I was walking through the forest enjoying the day. All of a sudden, I hear this wailing sound. It sounded like a distressed deer, or even a cat. Being the big animal lover I was, I went looking for the wounded animal. It wasn't long before I came to the edge of the property. Something was wrong, however, the noise sounded much farther away than it did before. The woods around me were also completely silent. I happened to look to my left to see a hunter's blind. Once I got closer, I noticed something bizarre. It was badly torn on the sides. As if someone got a knife and sliced into it. Suddenly, I hear the same distant wailing sound again. So I did something stupid, I made the noise right back at the thing, hoping that whatever it was would show itself. Not even 5 minutes later, I hear this low growling noise about 20 yards to my left. Even after wandering the woods for most of my life, I've never heard a sound like that before. I had to get out of there. I made a run for R's house, and it wasn't long before I came to his yard. I stopped to catch my breath. All of a sudden, I hear the same low growl coming from the bushes less than 10 yards away. So I ran all the way up to the research shed to find R. It wasn't long before I ran into him. I told him that a deer had growled at me. He was a very scientific guy after all, and I doubt he'd believe me. But in the back of my mind, I knew that this was no deer. I believed that whatever it was trying to lure me off of the property and do who knows what. A few years later I learned about skinwalkers and that they mimicked animal sounds and even voices to lure people to their deaths. Although I luckily never saw the thing, I believed that it was a skinwalker looking for its next victim. I found the courage to share this after listening to the numerous sightings of North American Indian mythical creatures, specifically the short people that seem to go by many names across the tribal regions of America. This exact type of creature has been sighted and discussed among Aboriginal people in Australia for thousands of years. In the southwest region, they're known as the Vurigi or hairy bush man. Standing a few feet tall, they possessed insane strength and speed. Prior to colonization, there were stories of their friendship/alliance with Aboriginal people, but also there were stories of conflict and people or even children being taken by them. There were specific rules Aboriginal adults told their children, such as avoiding water bodies at night and the evening, and no matter what, never, ever whistle in the dark. It invites the Vurigis, and it only spells trouble, although even some Aboriginal people say these stories are just to warn kids about water safety. Well, in 1998 I knew none of this because I'm not Aboriginal, and at the age of 10, when this all happened, I had never even met an Aboriginal person or been taught anything about Aboriginal culture in school. It was the 90s, and Australia had an uncomfortable relationship with the truth and colonization. Every school holiday I used to leave the city and visit my aunt in the picturesque southwest countryside. I needed no encouragement in going because I loved the outdoors and had free rein to run amok on the dirt bike and go fishing alongside the magnificent Blackwood River whenever I felt like it, and I went a lot. It was the 90s in Australia, and it was incredibly safe for a 10-year-old kid to roam the landscape for miles and hours on end, all alone with nothing but a trusty pocket knife. I was able to walk through my aunt's massive property to the edge of the forest, then into the depths where the river flowed through, fishing for trout and redfin. The last evening before I was due to go back home to the city, I was down there fishing alone as the sun was setting. I knew I'd get into trouble being out that late, but having already snared a few trout, I figured I'd be quickly forgiven, plus I was still getting bites. I remember having caught the fish and kept them in an old metal bucket. I was on my last few pieces of bait when I recall hearing a tiny pinging noise on the side of the bucket. At first I thought nothing of it because large gum nuts often fell from the trees, but then it happened again, much louder and more forceful this time. I remembered checking the bucket and realizing they were small rocks, not gum nuts at all. I looked around, assuming it was some kids from a neighboring property, which was very unlikely, as it was maybe a 30-minute walk to the next property. The other side of the river backed onto the national park, where there were no other farms for miles, plus I hadn't come across any kids throughout my entire stay at the farm. This is where it got pretty scary. The rocks got bigger, and they started flying in from different directions, cutting my cheek and hitting me in the head. At this stage I started crying. I was only 10 after all, and dropped the fishing rod. I had 3 large trout in the bucket, and my intention was to pick it up and run back to the farm as quick as I could. As I bent to pick it up, I was hit by another rock in the side of the head and fell over. I pulled myself up, and I stared over to the other side of the river, the main source of the rocks. What I saw paralyzed my whole body with fear. It was nearly dark at this stage, but I saw the outline of 3 short-looking bodies covered in hair. I would have put them at maybe a meter tall, 3 to 4 feet, the size of small children but with the bodies of men. Their faces looked like they were part ape/part human. It was their eyes though. Even though it was getting dark, their eyes had this piercing yellow glow but were completely black in the middle. They wore no clothes but were covered in extremely thick, clumpy hair all over their bodies, except from the knees down, and had arms that hung almost like cavemen. But here's the strangest thing. They stared at me almost without moving, like literal statues, with a curious expression fixed on their faces and making absolutely no noise whatsoever. It made no sense as only a few moments before rocks were pelting in from all directions, and yet now they appeared frozen except for their eyes, which followed me. I managed to pull myself up and ran faster than all hell. My aunt was standing on the balcony and watched me tear through the long grass as quick as I could, with blood and cuts on my face. I told her everything, and she called the police. One officer came by to get a statement, and he said he'd visit some of the other farms around town, but he was certain there weren't any other families in the area. My aunt just assumed I couldn't see the figures properly due to the lack of light and maybe even suffering concussion from the rocks that hit my head. She assumed they were kids or teens. I know what I saw though, and I'll never forget those murderous-looking yellow eyes. The next morning, I went with my aunt to collect my fishing rod and bucket. My aunt was shocked to see the fishing rod and bucket still there. She thought it was an opportunistic crime. We checked the bucket, and what we saw made our skin crawl. 3 perfect trout skeletons were floating in it, not one morsel left. We don't have bears and wolves in Australia, and even the odd dingo or fox wouldn't devour an entire fish and leave its skeleton there, without the bucket being tipped over. The whole ordeal was terrifying, but as things tend to happen when you're a kid, you just forget about it or it lives somewhere in the back of your mind rent-free for a while. The police officer found nothing of note, and as nothing was stolen, there was no need for further inquiry. It was the talk of the country pub for a few weeks though. My aunt was a local, and the town had experienced odd things throughout the years, such as the sighting of tiger-like animals in the deep forest and other strange noises or happenings reported by lumberjacks in the deep forest. It wasn't until I got into my 20s and became a social worker that I started working with Aboriginal communities in town. During celebratory events, I came to learn of the different Dreamtime creation stories, and eventually I had the confidence to tell an elder about what I went through. He recognized it as the Vurigis straight away and said I was lucky to leave that forest alive. He seemed to think that they must have believed I was an Aboriginal boy. I have a mixed racial background, and the protocol would have been for me to leave a couple of fish outside the bucket, skewered on sticks for them to come and collect after as payment for fishing in their river. But when I didn't, they reminded me, first few pelts, and when I still didn't, they eventually attacked. There aren't any Aboriginal families in that part of the Southwest, Caucasian only, to this day, which may explain why it only happened to me. The elder believed they could have taken me though for disobeying their sacred customs. That part wakes me up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night, because I believe they could have. It's not a story I tell to my family and friends, but I will confide in it with the odd Aboriginal colleague or client at work, and they tell me similar things. Don't even get me started on the Australian desert. I'm 36 now, and as time goes on, I find this event something I think about more often as the years roll on, despite becoming more logical and cynical in age. I ponder its significance and proof of otherworldly beings living alongside us on this planet. Thanks for listening. I'm going to start this story off by saying that before this experience I was not a firm believer in anything supernatural, but after I am convinced that there are horrible things out there. I was in 4th grade, and I lived around a somewhat isolated community in northwestern Canada. I was wearing snow pants and a parka as my mom was insistent on me wearing them even though I wouldn't actually be outside in the blizzard very long. I let out the front door and down the stairs, wandering around the front yard as I still had about 15 minutes before the bus arrived. I had a very limited view of the area, as my only light was from my iPod, whatever leaked from the windows, or the headlights of my dad's truck. I wasn't afraid, but lately me and my friends had been toying with the ideas of ghosts like any other 10-year-old kid would do, but I wasn't afraid. I had a slightly eerie feeling, almost like I was not quite alone out there. I decided to go check if my 2 dogs were awake and had made it to the garage foundation before I noticed some footsteps lightly crunching the snow about halfway between me and the doghouse. I looked around and saw this skeletal, pale figure crawling across the yard on all fours. The skin appeared pale and leathery. It seemed as if it was stretched over a much bigger skeleton than it was meant for. It looked towards me with its bald, pale head and seemed slightly shocked but not deterred in any way. I was absolutely frozen with fear, my heart beating like a drum. The Wendigo had come up in silly conversations that nobody had assumed to be true. I realized this as it slowly crawled off into the fields as if looking for something in the freezing cold. I was too afraid to go and check on the dogs, as I was more scared for myself than anything. I worked up the courage to run to the house, and I ran as fast as I could, almost slipping a couple of times but still keeping up an extremely fast pace. I opened the door, and in one fluid movement I slammed it and locked the door. Before collapsing, panting. To make the experience much worse, a week later my dad woke up at 3 a.m, panicked, and looked out the window. He claimed that he had seen a very similar creature. I went outside the next day, and to my horror, I found huge, human footprints cutting across the driveway. As I grew somewhat older, I researched Native American spirits and creatures, but specifically Wendigos. All I have to say is that if I see it again, it won't escape into the canola fields again. On Saturday, May 2, 2020, Bianca and I, Eduardo, were hiking the North Twin and South Twin Mountains in the Whites in New Hampshire. Early in the hike, we lost significant time trying to cross the inappropriately named Little River, which forced us to walk an extra mile to find a way across since the river had grown to a raging rapid due to snowmelt from a good skiing season. Nevertheless, we pushed hard to hike up, and we had a great time enjoying the views of the Pemigewasset Wilderness from the top of the ridge. We lost track of time, so on the way back we had to rush to still get out of the woods with some daylight. Due to this, I missed a step crossing one of the many brooks that fed the little river and got my shoes completely wet, which would make the remaining miles very uncomfortable. I decided to sit down to squeeze the water out of my socks and told Bianca to not stop and that I would catch up soon. Bianca didn't think twice and kept going, knowing that I would catch up quickly. I removed my shoes and then my socks and squeezed the water out as much as possible. When I finished drying myself, I noticed that the usual sounds in the forest had gone silent. No birds, no leaves being stepped on by squirrels, absolutely nothing was making a sound. I looked back at the trail where we had just come from, and it appeared that the darkness was coming in fast as it enveloped the trees towards me. An uncomfortable feeling crept in, so I quickly put my shoes back on and started running downhill to catch up with Bianca. Time went by, and there was no sight of her. I started to worry a bit, not really knowing about what exactly or why, but I wanted to catch up quickly. All of a sudden I ran over the crest of the trail, and there she was, not walking away but running towards me. After a deep sigh of relief, I asked why she was coming back, and she eerily repeated what I was thinking just a few minutes before. Sounds of the forest had gone quiet, the darkness was too much to bear alone, and a bad feeling had crept in. She had tried to tell herself that this was ridiculous and kept going for a little while, but at some point she followed her guts and turned around to find me. Now together we brushed the fear aside and started walking towards the trail exit. Everything was in order again. We finally got out of the trail, North Twin Trailhead, when it was really starting to get dark. There is a 2.5-mile long dirt road, Haystack Road, that connects the trail to the Daniel Webster Highway, where we had parked the car. The gate to the dirt road was still closed due to being early in the hiking season, so it was the only place we could park the car. We were now happily chatting away since we were stoked to have made it to the dirt road before complete darkness and figured we could easily use our flashlights on the road if we indeed needed them. But the moon was bright that night and so far so good. We passed the large, wooden bridge with the roaring river below, made jokes about a large tree that was laying on the road, looking like a big snake in the approaching darkness, and were fantasizing about a late pasta dinner back at home. While we were chatting, Bianca's eyes thought to make out a dark figure 150 feet ahead of us on the road. She couldn't be sure, so she asked me, "Is there another person ahead of us on the road?" I answered, "Yes, there is." We both squinted into the dusk. The figure did not move but seemed to be looking in our direction. There were not many features one could make out, except for the black, tall, and slim shadow standing there on two legs. I assumed it was another hiker who had come down late from the trail. The only person we had encountered all day was another guy returning from North Twin Mountain, who complained about not having brought snowshoes with him. He seemed a nice fellow and was on his way down when we were still on our way up. We also ended up doing South Twin Mountain after North Twin before turning around and descending, so he must have been way ahead of us. We figured he was easily back on his way home by now, so most probably the shadowy figure was likely another hiker on his way back to the parking lot, or so we thought. Though it was a bit odd that he was not moving at all and seemed to be looking in our direction. Bianca and I kept walking steadily without being too worried about the figure ahead when suddenly he or she/it started running towards our left into the woods. WTF? Did I just see that right? Because it was now moving, its shape was clearer to make out. It was lanky and skinny. It ran weirdly gracefully. Its arms were swinging off to the sides and somewhat seemed to be very long. I could not make out any backpack, clothing, colors, anything. All I could make out was a dark, tall shape that appeared to have no clothes, or at least none that we could make out in the dusk of the day, disappearing into the woods. This unexpected change of events immediately raised alarm bells in my head. Okay. That was definitely weird. He ran to the left into the woods, Bianca said in a dry fact-stating tone. I confirmed having seen the same thing. That was weird. I simply stated. Bianca very much agreed. Yes, very weird. Why would someone dart away like that from us? I quickly ran through different options in my head. Maybe some kids are playing late in the woods? No. That figure had not the shape of a kid or even a teenager. It had been too tall. Definitely adult looking. So that's not it. Maybe a homeless person who was living here somewhere in the woods? Maybe you didn't want to encounter any people during coronavirus times? Maybe. Or was it a crazy person looking to assault some harmless hiker couple? We couldn't be sure. We needed to get out of here before it got completely dark. Suddenly we both were on high alert. What we just had seen was unusual, and we didn't know what to make of it. We immediately picked up the pace, moving closer and closer to the spot where the thing had dashed into the woods. We really had no other option than walking by that area to get to the car. Keeping to the right side of the road, we got our hiking poles ready for a possible attack. We made some noise with them, on purpose, to either scare the thing more away, if it was scared of us in the first place, or to point out that we were not afraid, which of course we were, and ready for a fight if needed. I quickly picked up a wooden stick, broke off a small piece, and placed it firmly into my fist with a sharp, pointy end sticking out to have an additional short-range weapon at hand. I was ready for whatever would come out of the woods, or so I wanted to think. Passing the location where we had lost sight of the figure, we stared into the woods to our left, but we saw no sign of the person. It was still bright enough that we could make out the individual trees and certainly anybody standing there if there was someone. But we didn't see anyone or anything. We kept walking, constantly looking around us, making sure nobody was following us. We started to make plans for different scenarios. How far to the car? Bianca asked. About 1.9 miles, I answered. Okay. Too far to start running like crazy. Better to keep walking fast and keep the energy if we do need to defend ourselves. We are both trained martial artists and not afraid of a fight against a human, but by now we weren't sure that we had encountered a human being at all. Humanoid, yes, but a human? We couldn't be sure. Rule number 1, we stick together at all times. For now, we keep flashlights turned off to preserve our night vision and conceal our location better. The moonlight lit up the road quite nicely, and so far nothing or nobody is behind us. Good. What if suddenly a car shows up from the back? Unlikely, but who knows? We hide in the woods. Yes, okay. How far to the car? 1.5 miles. Okay. Let's keep walking and keep our eyes and ears open. With our adrenaline pumping, we walk as fast as possible. Good that we took a light pack today, I thought. Only 6.5 kilograms compared to the usual 10 to 11 kilograms. It will be easier running with it if necessary. We keep looking around and especially behind us, listening into the dark. By now, complete darkness had fallen, but the moonlight is still strong. How far? Bianca asked again. I check out my ViewRanger app and announce 0.5 miles. Okay, that's 800 meters, we both grew up with the metric system and still convert distances in our heads. Totally sprint able if something shows up behind us at this point. Finally, we see cars going by in a distance that are driving on Daniel Webster Highway. Almost there. We see the Jeep. It's still there. Hopefully the keys are too. I envision what we would do if not. Or if the tires are slashed. Geez. Stop thinking that crazy stuff. I tell myself. Keys are where we left them, tires are good. Our car is also the only one in the lot. Interesting. We throw backpacks and hiking poles in the car while still keeping an eye on our surroundings. We hop in and quickly lock all the doors without thinking twice and get the hell out of there. Safe. On the drive home, we again run through different scenarios. Why was the figure behaving the way it did? Who was it, or what was it? What we know for sure is that the encounter felt eerie and weird. And that the way the figure moved and looked had also been quite unnerving. It definitely had been very skinny and lanky. I was somewhat sure it had been a human person running around in the woods, possibly with a few screws loose, but otherwise definitely human-like. It certainly hadn't looked like an animal, after all, it walked and ran on 2 legs. It had also not been Sasquatch-like looking, as I always thought people described those having big and muscle-loaded bodies, just like a big ape. At least that's what they looked like in my head, if they existed, which I heavily doubted. At this point, we thought we had encountered a strange human being who behaved a bit weird for whatever reason. However, Bianca brought up a good point about the arm swinging off to the side, like we had both seen very clearly. Who runs like that? She kept saying, and for sure that was definitely odd. Or so we were convinced of until we looked up urban New Hampshire legends that night when we arrived home just for the fun of it. Because what else are you going to do following a 27-kilometer hike and a weird encounter in the White Mountains? At first, nothing really caught our attention, but then we came across stories about the Wood Devils of Coos County, New Hampshire. Coos County is the largest and northernmost county in the state and almost entirely remote. We read, reports of skinny, tall, gray-haired animals date all the way back to the 19th century. Sightings of these fast-moving, vaguely humanoid Sasquatches have been made along the Appalachian Trail, in parts of Vermont, and along the Canadian border, but Coos County remains the hotbed of Wood Devil activity, especially in the White Mountains. Hold on, what? Skinny, tall, humanoid? Come again? The creatures are said to be tall, at least 7 feet in height, and very thin. They are said to be very elusive and are often seen standing still against a tree. Said to be fast and nimble, possibly to move from behind one tree to another quickly. If it cannot hide, it will stand perfectly still until it knows the person can see it. We also discovered sketches from my sightings that show long arms and a body just like the one we had seen. Lovely. So, who knows what we saw, but it is certainly not unimaginable that some rare creatures are living in those woods without our knowledge. Thinking about it, I might even prefer a shy Sasquatch creature to some crazy human being. In any case, next time we will make an effort to be back by sundown from our hiking adventures. Who really knows for sure what is out there? The story I'm about to tell is true. So I'm 16 years old and about 5'8", and 115 pounds, so I'm not intimidating to anything or anyone, and the area I live in is rich with Native American history, Manly Creek, I believe. So about 2 weeks ago I decided to go walking behind my house at about 10 o'clock at night because I stayed inside all day playing video games, so I thought I could use the exercise. I also brought my 2 dogs, Mike and Jojo, and a flashlight. Jojo is an Australian Shepherd, and Mike is a ratter. Now to provide a bit of backstory, I always used to go hunting in the woods behind my house, and I know it like the back of my hand. So we walked for a little bit with nothing unusual happening, so we decided to turn back and start to walk home, but the whole time I felt an uneasy feeling, like the stereotypical being watched feeling. We were walking back down the trail when one of my dogs, Mike, who was ahead of me, started to bark and chase something into the woods. This isn't unusual because he always chases armadillos, so I ran to catch up to him to see what he was barking at, but when I got up to the spot where I thought I heard him barking, the woods went unusually quiet, which caused a chill to go down my back because I was always told that when that happens, there's always a predator in the area. So I called my dog's name for about 5 minutes with no response, which was really worrying because he always comes back when I call him almost all the time, but nothing, not even a sound. Then, out of nowhere, my dog comes running out of the woods with his tail tucked between his legs, and he was shaking violently, thinking he got hurt. I tried to see what was wrong with him, which is when I heard one of the most unnatural, scariest noises I have ever heard. It sounded like a wolf howling mixed with a person screaming at the top of their lungs. That was enough for me to grab my 2 dogs and take their lungs. That was enough for me to grab my 2 dogs and take off running back to my house, and while I ran back, I swear I could hear something moving on one side of me, like something was just tearing down every bush and tree in its way. Then I'd say I was about halfway back to my house when I had an urge to look back, which is one of the worst mistakes I have ever made because the thing I saw in the middle of the trail is enough to send fear through anyone. This creature looked like a human, but its skin was stretched across its bones. It had decomposing skin, patches of brown hair, and blood dripping from its body. It looked like it hadn't eaten in weeks, and when my flashlight shined on the thing, it let out another inhuman scream, and it got up off of all fours and on its back legs, and it started to run straight at me, expecting to be thrown to the ground and devoured or killed, but then in the blink of an eye, it was gone, as if it were never there. I ran all the way back to my house, and I about busted down my door trying to get in. I took my 2 dogs into my room, where I stayed up all night. I tried to go to sleep to just forget about the creature, but I swear I could hear screaming still coming from the woods and all through the night, and I thought I could hear a scraping noise and clicking noise coming from outside my window. After this incident, I have never heard any sounds or seen that thing again. I haven't told anyone in my family because they are skeptics and they would probably think I'm crazy. I went back the next day to see if I could find anything, and the bushes on my side looked as if someone bulldozed a straight line through them, and the trees had claw marks and dried up blood with strange markings on the ground. In all of my years of being outdoors and hunting, I have never seen anything like that, and I believe it's safe to say I'm never going back behind my house again night or day. I saw a werewolf/dogman/hellhound less than a foot away. Driving on a super rural, dirt road in central Florida, about an hour outside of Ocala. Couldn't move more than 5 to 8 miles an hour, literally couldn't even hit 10 if you wanted to without a massive 4x4 pickup truck, which I didn't have, due to the road consisting of mostly sand with occasional puddles of water. The dry parts were like beach sand, and the wet parts were like quicksand, so yeah, very slow going. I came around a corner and saw what I thought was a solid black deer, which was shocking for 2 reasons. For one, I'd never seen nor heard of a black deer before. For the other, it wasn't like the medium dog-sized deer that are common in the East. It looked like the type of deer you'd see in the Rockies, where I'd lived previously. Anyway, no way to turn around or reason to want to at this point, so just continued at 3 to 5 miles per hour towards it. It was about 20 yards away when it turned to face me and my friend in the car. It was clearly not a deer. It was a dog. It looked like a Doberman, maybe mixed with an Arabian Saluki. Solid black, with bright, blue, reflective eyes. Again, no way to turn around, so just continued towards it. It stood off to the driver's side of the car, and as we approached it, it stood completely still except for to slowly track its head with us and to slightly straighten its chest/neck so my rearview mirror didn't hit it. It then did something that still freaks me out 10 years later and hunched down to look at me through the window. Meaning, its chest/belly height was as tall as my car, and it had to crouch down to look in. Thing was literally so close, it was fogging up my driver's side window like something out of Jurassic Park, and its nose was smudging the fog it was blowing on the glass as it tried to look in. That was basically it. We continued driving, 3 to 5 miles per hour, and it stayed in the exact spot, just watching us until we turned around a bend in the road. The final thing that really gets me is that the only other time I've seen a dog kind of fit those proportions is with dogs in the toddler stage, not quite puppies, but certainly not adults. Basically, when their feet are growing to their full size and their limbs get all long and gangly, but the body itself and head aren't fully grown. So not only did I see a dog, wolf, creature, taller than my car, which sure was a sedan, but sedans are still an easy 5 to 5.5 feet tall. At the chest on all fours. It looked like it wasn't even fully grown. My friend and I are still in touch and talk about it occasionally. We always have just called it the hellhound or the werewolf. No idea what it was, but there you go. My story is about a scary experience I had about 15 years ago while exploring Canada that made me feel like I was crazy. When I was 30 years old, I went on a trip alone to explore the boreal forest in Canada and Alaska. I went alone to try and find myself again after going through some very stressful circumstances, but that's a different story and does have a connection to what happened during my trip. I had planned this trip for close to a year and spent a lot of money to ensure this trip was what I wanted. It cost close to $70,000 for just over 6 months, which was actually cheap for what I wanted to do. I planned this trip to be a solo, secluded adventure as much as I could to explore northern remote Alaska and the territories of Canada, which included a 4-week camping trip, which is where the scary story begins. I hired some of the indigenous people to help with my plans. They were very kind and offered me many options to satisfy my requests. One of the options they recommended really stood out. However, I did have to allow company for most of the first 3 months of my trip, but the camping trip would be 100% solo. It sounded amazing, so I agreed. I would start in Point Hope, Alaska, and make my way across to northern Ontario. The trip would start off by mostly dog sledding, snowmobiling, other snow vehicles, and flying where it wasn't feasible to travel by land. I would mostly hunt and fish for food, create fires, and cook what I caught, but I also brought plenty of survival food. This is why I agreed with the company. They were guides who knew the terrain and how to navigate through it safely. They shared some food they brought with them, like banyak and dried meats like deer, moose, and elk. We would camp out along the way or stay in yurts, sometimes even motels, in small towns. They told me stories about tales from their culture passed down by many generations, and I ended up enjoying their company. The trip was amazing. I saw so much wildlife, and the scenery was amazing, especially the sky. I had never really seen northern lights like this before, and the crackling was something I didn't know they did. They were bright, and with how clearly I saw the Milky Way, it gave me a sense of peace. I saw a pack of wolves take down a moose, owls, eagles, foxes, and even polar bears, which made my guides a bit nervous, though they did have a firearm for emergencies. We laughed, had a few drinks, cooked beef, hog, and fish, and had a blast. It was an amazing experience. They guided my journey until we got to Fort Severn, where we would rest for the day. From there, we would part ways, and I would travel alone. This is where my trip turns into my most horrifying experience. The next morning, I gathered my things, bought a bit of food, and headed out. I planned to head deep into the Ontario boreal forest alone. I had previously pinned a location deep into the forest on my GPS to travel to. I wasn't 100% sure I could make it, but that was part of the challenge. I traveled on foot for 10 hours straight during the day and slept at night in a hammock. It wasn't straightforward by any means. The forest was dense and difficult to tread through, but I was determined. Everything was fine for the first 2 days. I managed to cover about 20 kilometers. But on the third morning, I had an eerie feeling. That morning, some of my stuff was scattered around, but I just told myself that it was probably some animals trying to get at the food I hung in a tree. But the weird thing was, I didn't hear anything during that night. It was very quiet, no noises of animals or insects. It didn't occur to me that anything was wrong. So I gathered my things, ate, and then headed out again. It started to get dark, so I decided to find a good place to sleep for the night. Once I did, I set up camp. This time, everything that wasn't essential was hung in the trees. I lit a fire, made some food, and just enjoyed the scenery as the sun set. Then, once it got really dark, I heard something. It sounded like a very familiar voice of someone calling for help in a little girl's voice. "Help me, I'm lost." That voice almost made me cry, and it was extremely unnerving. I looked around the best I could, but at that point, it was pitch black, and my line of sight was probably about 10 feet. "Sherry? Are you okay? Could you see my flame?" Then again, I heard, "Help me." The voice changed a little, it was deeper. Now the hairs on the back of my neck raised, and a sudden sense of danger overwhelmed me. I took out my flashlight and looked around more thoroughly, and then that's when I saw it. A figure hunched over, within the trees, arms fully stretched out to the side, with its fingers spread out in an unnatural manner, eyes glowing. It had an oversized mouth open very wide and smiling. I just stood there trying to comprehend what the duck I was seeing until its head rotated upside down, and it collapsed to the ground, then started crawling really fast towards me. I heard bones snapping. I don't know what I was thinking, but I heard a whisper, "Run," so I bolted. I left everything I had there except the flashlight in my hand and a bit of emergency dried food I had in my pouch. I ran as fast as I could and didn't stop, but I heard it pursuing me and calling me, telling me to stop in what sounded like my wife. I kept hearing, "Please stop, I am scared," but I ran anyway. I don't know how I managed to navigate through the forest, but I did end up falling down a small hill into a wet mud pit and lying there. I heard my wife calling me, Sherry asking me where I was or saying she was scared, a cell phone ringing to my wife's tone, weird chattering noises, a voice saying, "I'm hungry, where are you?" growling, and lots of footsteps all over the place. But I was so petrified, I just laid there, paralyzed with fear like I never felt before. That mud pit ended up being my saving grace because after what seemed like an eternity, the voices stopped, and I heard the sound of morning birds, and the sun began to rise. I waited until it was fully light out and crawled out of the pit. I gathered my head and checked what I had, a bit of water, a couple of bars of food, and thankfully my GPS. I managed to navigate to a country road. It took me another 5 days, staying in ditches at night along the road while this thing was trying to hunt me, taunting me with every trick it had up its sleeve. I think the mud made it lose track of me. During the day, I would navigate towards the closest town. Along the way, I managed to get to a highway where I saw one lone semi-truck traveling towards the town. I flagged it down. The guy, an older gentleman driving, looked and asked if I was okay. All I said was, "I've been lost for over a week straight and running from some animals." He looked at me and said, "You were lucky." The man told me a story about his brother, who went hunting in these forests. He said he wouldn't talk about what happened, except that the forest was haunted. Whatever his brother experienced scared him enough that he never went hunting ever again. I ended up telling him what happened. The guy's face went pale, and we were silent for the rest of the ride. He drove me to Kenora, where he let me stay at his place for the night. In the morning, his brother came by. He and the old man talked. The old man's name was Steve, and his brother is Jim. Jim looked back at me, eyes wide open. I nodded back at him. We both shared our stories. What I described was exactly what he saw. I ended up staying in Kenora, and we all became pretty good friends. But Steve died about 3 months after this. He was 63. His brother and I stayed friends for about 2 years until he died of liver failure because he was an alcoholic. I tried my best to get him to stop drinking, but the nightmares kept him reliving that experience. I had them too, so I understood he needed some sort of escape. I too became an alcoholic. The nightmares were just too much. He was only 35 when he passed. His friendship meant a lot to me. Afterwards, about another year, I moved to Winnipeg and tried to get my life back in order. I joined AA and got clean. This is where I met my current friends. I told my story at a meeting. I started with, "I don't care if you think I'm crazy." Skinwalker in the woods of Maine. It was late October 2017. I had just gotten home after a long day of school. I decided to hop on my PS4 and play some Call of Duty Black Ops 3 with some online friends. As hours passed, old and new friends came and went. I was home alone for the week because my mother and father went on a business trip to Georgia, as well as visiting family. It wasn't the first time that I had to be home alone for a long period of time. I usually went to bed around the time of 9:30, but since it was a Friday and I was home alone, I decided that I would stay up. 9:30 came, then 10, then 11, then midnight, so on and so forth, you get the point. My eyes felt heavy and were foggy because of how long I was playing video games, but the fact of me wearing contacts doesn't help either. I decided to check the time since I knew that it was getting late. It was 1:20 a.m. I was in a match, so I didn't want to get up and turn everything off. I decided that I was going to finish up the current match that I was in and go to bed. As I was finishing up the match, a putridly bad and musty smell had hit my nostrils. To be honest, it tensed me up for quite a bit, and I gagged on how awful it was. I knew I wasn't going to be able to sleep through it, so I played a couple more matches in hope for the smell to eventually go away, but that wasn't the case. Over time, minute by minute, it almost seemed that the scent was getting closer and stronger. I attempted to ignore it and continue to play my game. I have a noise-canceling headset, but I could swear that I had heard footsteps from behind me, but I remembered that I had 3D sound as well, so being me, I ignored it. Then I heard tapping. I took off my headset to confirm that it was the game, and then I heard it again. It was coming from the window behind me. It had shades over it, but with the outside light on, I saw a silhouette of something almost human-like. I stood in my room frozen in fear, looking at the silhouette, wondering if I was just delirious on sleep, but then its head ticked to the side like a bird, and it tapped on the window once again, in the same pattern. As adrenaline shot through my body, I decided, being the curious, young teen I was, to open the shades. When I got closer, the stench got stronger, and I could tell now that it was the smell of something decaying and dying. I thought, but then I remembered the tapping and how in unison it was. I finally got the courage to pull back the curtains, and I had wished I hadn't. It had a human face, but where the eyes were supposed to be, there were just sockets. It had sharp teeth so jagged I could swear it could tear through steel. Its face was decomposing and rotting. It looked like it had been dead for such a long time. I stood from where I had opened the window shades. In fear. I couldn't take my eyes off of this thing. I didn't know if it were looking at me or not because of its empty soulless eye sockets. Then it tilted its head with a sharp movement that startled me, and I screamed. It got up with so much speed and went back into the woods. When it got up, I saw its body and how contorted it was and how awkward it moved. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, for weeks even. I haven't seen the thing since that day. I am only sharing this now because in class a couple of weeks ago we learned about Native American cryptids, and the skinwalker fit the description well. The only thing is that it usually takes for things that it has killed. My question is, who is the person it killed to take their form? I just hope that that's the only time I see that thing, because who knows what it might do if we cross paths again. Could it be a dying animal that just so happened to stumble upon my window? Skinwalkers, for the record, they're not only a Navajo phenomenon. It's super common on here for people to post skinwalker stories from all over the US, and something even Europe. Usually posts from anywhere, but the SW receives a lot of negative comments along the lines of it wasn't a skinwalker, they only exist in Navajo lands, and the poster feels chastised instead of helped or heard. In reality, many Native American tribes have at almost identical beliefs about witches, used to include women and men, possessed of dark power who can shapeshift using the skins of animals. Especially in here, where people come to tell their story or get help, there's no reason to dogmatically enforce the idea skinwalkers are only Navajo, unless using the actual Navajo language name. It needs to be realized that other tribes all over North America held similar beliefs and had similar experiences, even up to modern times. My mother was born and raised on a Seneca reservation, and I spent every summer and winter of my life there, so I'm going to focus on Seneca beliefs as an example. The Seneca are one of the Iroquois Federation, more accurately called the Haudenosaunee, literally people of the Long House, aka the Six Nations/tribes, living in the far NE, US, and SE Canada, about as far away from the Navajo as you can get in the US. If this doesn't show how widespread these beliefs and practices were, I don't know what will. Because you have no real reason to believe me, I'm going to quote from actual books. The following is from a book by an author who lived among and studied the Seneca in the 1800s. He eventually documented the tales, each recorded verbatim and attributed to an individual, with their tribe, clan, and rank, around 1890-1905. Consider the following information on witches, i.e., evil medicine men, though a witch doctor or charm holder is a kind of good medicine man. This belief in witches and sorcerers has not been entirely eradicated among the state Indians to this day. All the older Indians have witch stories to tell, and some of them have had personal experience with witchcraft. It is not considered good form to talk about witches. It matters not whether the Indian is a Christian or non-Christian as far as witchcraft is concerned. Both Christians and followers of Handsome Lake express a belief in it. An understanding of the Seneca belief in witchcraft is essential for an understanding of Seneca folklore, and not only folklore but the psychology of the group. Certainly, all through the folklore of the Seneca, one will find a steady belief in the ability of powered persons to transform themselves into any sort of creature desired, particularly the form of some chosen animal. One of the most common methods is to have a collection of animal pelts into which the person may enter and assume the character of the beast while retaining human intelligence. Most frequently in modern times, the witch is reputed to be able to become an owl, a dog, or a big snake. To guard against witches, many Indians buy witch powder from witch doctors. By using this properly, the witch is kept away from the person and his household. In cases of uncertainty, the witch doctor goes into a trance and prescribes the proper remedy. Sometimes a person is bewitched by a spirit or by a charm that he has failed to pacify. The charm then causes bad dreams, wounds, broken bones, and even death in the family unless satisfied by the proper ceremony. Contents of a charm holder's bundle. Note, this is good orenda or medicine, magic, and would be owned by a good witch doctor, not an average person. These objects are called otsinaki and Individuals also had other charms and different kinds of stones or wooden tablets that they scraped into a powder as medicine. By consulting his bundle, a charm holder could tell how to overcome a sorcerer's influence or determine what spirit had been offended and needed propitiation. Each bundle was sung for in an appropriate ceremony of the charm holder's society. Contents of a witch bundle. In a witch bundle found in an abandoned house of an old witch, the following articles were found. 1 bundle containing miniature weapons and utensils. 1 bundle containing dolls made of some soft brown wood. 1 package of small sacks from animal hearts. 1 ball of fine cord or thread. 1 box of dried snake blood. 1 bottle of eye oil. 1 package of hair of different shades. 1 bundle containing packages of various powders. 1 box containing a collection of various greases. 1 package containing smaller parcels of nail parings. 1 package of many wrappings containing a smaller inner package, with wet blood, and containing a small, sharp bone. 1 dried human finger. Collection of snake skins. The witch is also reputed to have had a black calf skin and a big dog skin. She was capable of transforming herself. When she finally died and was buried, a witch light, Gahai, was seen over the pond. Related in 1903. There's far too many Seneca stories to list about people with the power to turn into animals by donning their skins. A sick woman with a wasting disease noticed that every night something would peek in her window. Her husband could find no evidence of this until one night after a snowstorm he found the tracks of a large dog outside the window. Following the tracks to the road, he saw that they became human footprints and were lost in the other tracks at the side of the road. The next morning, among the friends that called upon the sick woman was an old lady who lived near the creek in a small house. She was a widow and lived alone. This old lady asked about the sick woman in such a peculiar manner that the husband grew suspicious. After the old woman left, the sick woman began to feel much worse. That night she screamed, "She is looking at me." And the husband, going outside, saw as before dog tracks running down to the road. He watched, and soon some men came by, and he asked them if they had seen a large dog. The men said they did. One had just run down the road toward the creek. Morning came, and the husband was determined to investigate further. He crossed the road and walked down the other side until he came to the redacted name of the old woman's place. He noticed that a large dog had run along the fence and had leapt over it. On the other side, there were human footprints going to the house. Morning came, and the old woman called again, inquiring about the health of the sick woman. This time the husband said, "If you don't stop witching my wife, I will fix you." The old lady asked him what he meant and said that she was not a witch. The husband then resolved to watch in the woodshed all night, if need be, and to catch the dog looking into the window. He got some blankets to keep himself warm and waited with his rifle. After a while, he heard a sniffling sound and presently heard something walking around the house. Cautiously, he looked out and saw the dog with its paws on the windowsill of his wife's room. Fire was coming out of the dog's eyes. The husband now ran out and chased the dog, which ran down the road. There were many people on the road, for it was moonlight and it was slaying time. They saw him chasing the dog. It ran to the fence and jumped over. As it poised in midair over the fence, the man fired his gun. There was a yelp, and the people saw something shoot through the air and jump into the window of the cabin. The people watched this and looked over the fence, but there was no mark or track on the snow, except some dog hair. 3 days later, the people went to the house and found the old woman dead on her bed with a bullet in her heart. There was dog hair on the window where she had dived through. It was sure then that she had been a witch. The sick woman recovered. The Seneca also believed in other creatures, which sound a lot like what people describe when they talk about skinwalkers or wendigos. Here's some details from a story about Nyagwaha, meaning the great bear. Naked bear. Monster bear, or similar. Please note that Nyagwaha was not a shapeshifter, but a distinct type of creature. I only include it because it fits a lot of what people describe when they talk about seeing a skinwalker, and it's a common creature in Seneca stories. The great bear has pale human-like skin, no fur, a large head, ferocious teeth and giant fangs, and hungers for the flesh of humans. It'll kill indiscriminately and without remorse, and often stalks its prey through the woods. The Cherokee, Cree, and many other tribes have similar stories about a creature, often with the native name referencing bears and having the same traits. The naked bear sometimes speaks and is extremely hard to kill, usually only by an arrow to the sole of its foot. Its fangs hold powerful orenda, medicine, magic. What follows are quotes directly from an old book of stories collected from the Seneca elders in the 1800s/very early 1900s. It can sometimes be intimidated to the point of defeat if an intended victim truly has no fear in their heart, is a moral/good person, and has a genuine, unwavering confidence that they won't be harmed, and sometimes such people directly verbally threaten the naked bear. Oh ho, great bear! I hold no fear for you, and I shall kill you. I'm not suggesting you do this, just saying, You'll recognize many similarities to Wendigo, Skinwalkers, and other beasts. And some interesting tips that I can neither recommend nor verify but that were known to the Seneca and other tribes. The Seneca and others also believed in little people or drum dancers, very similar to the Fae and other Western folklore about little people. They also believed in flint coats, which were like trolls or stone giants, and a host of other creatures you'll find in other Native American and even European lore. So basically, when someone sees a skinwalker in another part of the US, it's kind of BS to say those are only Navajo. Other tribes held the same belief, of Wikes with the same abilities. So who in the hell is to say only the Navajo beliefs are true? Maybe they do have more skinwalkers, or because the SW is more wild/open country, they can't hide as easily in the woods. But it's insulting to imply only the Navajo among hundreds of Na tribes have the belief in that power or witches with that ability. Yeah, it probably wouldn't be a Navajo skinwalker in NY. No reason it couldn't be a Seneca skinwalker, and no, I've never seen one or any cryptid type animal. When I was 8 years old, me and my mother were coming home one night from some late evening shopping. We had a long driveway that led to this roundabout, with our house off to the right side of the roundabout. Well, I was looking out the side window. We lived on a heavily wooded property, and staring at trees, and my mother let out this loud scream and swerved about halfway up our driveway, and we crashed into an old brick fireplace. There was an old barbecue area with a ruined brick fireplace in this overgrown area from decades before we moved in, and I had no idea why she swerved or what happened. Later that night, after we got over the shock of the crash, my mother was explaining to my father how she saw a tall man in a suit and top hat carrying a cane walking across the driveway. Since we lived on a rather large property, about 15 acres with a dam and a large metal shed that spanned half the length of the property at the north end, we assumed someone had snuck onto the property, and immediately my father called the police, who came out and checked the property and couldn't find anyone. Since then we didn't see anyone or anything like that, except 3 months later when I walk into the kitchen around 3 a.m. to get a drink, and when I turn the light on, I see the tall man standing there staring back at me when he then smiles and the light blows out. I immediately scream and wake my parents, who come sprinting down the hallway and ask me what happened, and I was terrified and barely able to explain what I had seen, but we chalked this up to a nightmare or the dark playing tricks on my eyes, and I got over it. That would be the last I saw of the tall man for another 6 months, when again me and my mother were returning home from afternoon shopping, and as we were driving up the dark driveway there, he was standing in the middle of the road. This time both my mother and I saw him, and before our very eyes, he vanished. Me and my mother immediately agreed that we both saw what had just happened, and when explaining it to my father, he said it must have been a large bat or something and not to worry about it. 2 days later I was in the large shed. My father was an engineer for large trucks and ran a business out of one end of the shed while the house was on the other end. We also had the occasional party in the house end of the shed, so there was a wooden stage built in the corner. We would store stuff under this stage that we weren't using, like old tech, magazines, newspapers, and stuff. Well, I was going under the stage to get an old vacuum head for my mother, and at the very back of the stage I see the tall man's face peering back at me, smiling in the darkness, and running screaming out of the shed all the way back into the house and telling my parents what had happened. But yet again, when they went there to inspect the area, nothing and no one was to be found. At this point, both me and my mother were on edge about this vanishing man that kept showing up around the property. One day my mother invited one of her friends around, and she went to pick her up, and when they returned, they both burst in the door screaming about how they saw a man hanging from a tree halfway up the driveway. Now my mother had never mentioned to her prior to this anything about this vanishing tall man, and yet they had both seen him in a tree before dropping down and disappearing as he hit the ground. This made my mother immediately want to move from this property, and 3 months later we would move to a much smaller property, leaving my father behind since he said it was all foolish nonsense. So me and my mother moved to a small home in the suburbs, and I figured finally that would be the end of it all. When I was 10 years old, me and my mother were still living in that small house. My parents were still separated, and one night I came out at 3 a.m. again and stepped into the kitchen of the new house and turned on the light and began to have a panic attack because there was the tall man staring back at me again before raising his finger to his lips and doing a shush motion before the lights blew out yet again. I stood there petrified in the door the entire time, and my mother immediately came running out of her room with a flashlight, and there was nobody to be seen. We moved out the next day, and my father bought a new house, and we moved back in with him. When I was 13 years old, my mother and my grandfather were talking about scary stories, and she brought up the tall man in the top hat with the cane. My grandfather's face turned pale, and he said he had also seen someone matching that description years ago when on our property but never brought it up before this point. My entire family began bringing up stories of this man and the multiple times they had seen him around the property, both around the dam and the fireplace area, appearing in trees and in the darkness, and this terrified everyone, as he couldn't possibly be imaginary if everyone had seen him. 10 years later they demolished that house on the large property, and they tore down that old brick fireplace, and inside they found the bones of a large man buried under the fireplace with no idea how he got there or how long he had been there. To this day I still get chills and feel like I'm being watched whenever I talk about this, and nobody has ever believed me or my mother outside of the family or people who have seen the tall man on the property. I am now 30 years old. I have never and refused to ever believe in ghosts or paranormal activity, but I can't explain that tall man, and I don't think I ever will be able to, and it haunts me to this day. I can still remember his face perfectly, and I have had countless nightmares about him. Forest people, aka Sasquatch. You have to see it to believe it. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I could hardly believe it. It took several experiences and having someone else there for a few experiences for me to get over it and just accept it. I so badly wanted to be mistaken, because that is much easier than learning to adjust your whole worldview. I am a member of a small club. I hope they stay hidden and protected forever. People would go and hunt them. Good luck with that, BTW. If you don't bother them, they are curious, but I never had a problem. I was bum rushed once and had a beautiful song sung to me and my husband. It sounded like something out of this world. I knew what it was, but my husband was looking up, thinking it must be a UFO making a song of introduction. My husband is a molecular biologist PhD and not into anything like this. He had an effortless time accepting this as a reality. It sounded like angels singing. I have also been blessed with a few special gifts. Moved away, but it seems once they know you know, if you are in the right spot, you can spot the signs and make new friends if you'd want. I got limes from being out in the woods, so I have cooled my jets on romping around sadly. I honestly think they are everywhere. I have lived where they come around every 2 weeks or so and lived somewhere that they were there all the time, as far as I could tell. Look for golf balls, deflated mylar balloons, and bones. They use those for markers. No one is golfing in the woods unless they want a knot on their head or a punch to the balls.